I'm a 33-year-old guy. This happened when I was freshly 21, and it's still unresolved, if you'd like to call it that. This was a Friday night, and I had gotten off of work at around 5:30 and was ready to make plans for the night. I was recently single at that point, and with asking readers not to judge, I had to make up for lost time. I had met a few new girls, but most other single girls that I knew didn't think that my breakup was for real, because my girlfriend and I had been together for such a long time. As a type to kind of stay away from clubs, I began to explore online dating. While at home, I start looking at girls near me on Plenty of Fish. For some reason that night, I really wanted to be in the company of a woman, and the hour I had spent with no suitable responses began to wear on my patience. I eventually looked at Craigslist and posted a personals ad. Now, I know Craigslist isn't the best place to meet people, but at this point, I was thinking with my other head, if you know what I mean. I went out for an hour or two, and when I returned home, I noticed I had some responses to my ad. Mostly spam, obvious escorts, and potential catfishes. I may have been desperate, but I wanted someone that I felt comfortable with, on a friend and personal level. After weeding out all the mess, I saw one response that looked legit. I could tell she had read the ad, as it was an actual written response. She even included a few pics, all of which looked normal. She was cute, but didn't look like a model or from a magazine or anything like that. They just looked like run-of-the-mill personal selfies. In hindsight, there was something about that I didn't catch at first, which is important to the rest of the story. I use a dummy email for Craigslist, and I have it set up so that pictures don't download automatically. I learned my lesson after posting an ad for a table and getting a dick pic. However, these pics showed up right away as soon as I opened the email. All of this will tie in later. After some back and forth, I decide that I'll head over to her place. She gives me the address, and I see that it's an apartment building. Even better, as I'm always thinking of safety. I didn't want to go inside an actual home. I get there and email her that I'm outside, just to give me the exact building and apartment number. She gives me the instruction to walk to the courtyard of the apartment, so she can make sure I am who I'm saying I am. Understandable. I said that I was 5'11", and I'm sure it would be sort of scary on her end if someone 6'5" was out there. After seeing that it was truly me, she says she has something to tell me. I'm thinking the worst. Start to think of what it could be. She then tells me, "I'm really a man. I'm sorry. But now, I'm pissed." And that washes over me immediately, as I feel played. I'm prepared to just take my loss and quickly head back to my car, when I get more rapid-fire emails. He tells me that if I still want to come in, that he can give me money, cook me food, have drinks ready for me, or whatever. He sounded like he just really wanted the company. But I'm sorry, I'm not just going to chill with some random guy. He sends the last email that simply says, $200, 2 hours, no touching, no sex. I'd be lying if I said it didn't catch my eye, and I find myself walking up to his door. Stupid, I know, but at this point, I'm thinking I'll just take his $200, maybe knock over some of his things for tricking me, before leaving. My better judgment gets the best of me, thankfully, and about 5 feet from the door, I turn around and leave. I decided that this was a sign that I needed to stay home for the night. I stopped at a 7-Eleven to grab a beer. I get back in my car and start reading through Facebook, when all of a sudden, I get a Facebook message from someone I don't know, who I can tell is using a fake profile. The message says, "I'm sorry. Can you just please come back?" I get upset at the nerve of this guy, and then the air escapes from my throat. How did he get my personal Facebook? I used a fake email that has no ties whatsoever to my real name. I message him back, "Leave me alone. I'm not interested." The man then threatened me by saying something along the lines of, "You should really take a second to listen," before inserting my real name and my job. While my name was listed on my Facebook, my job wasn't. And while it wasn't completely accurate, this particular job is one that I held before I went off to college, it still freaked me out that he got that information. I told the man, "Either stop, or I'm coming back with some help to make you stop." I didn't get any more messages after that. I deleted the Facebook ones, deleted my email account, and went home. 2 nights later, I'm on my computer when again I get a Facebook message from the same guy that says, "Black shirt." I don't even begin to give the time of day to decipher that before deleting the message. I block him. 10 seconds later, I come to the realization that I'm wearing a black V-neck shirt. I look at the window as if I'm suspecting someone to be peering inside, when I remember that I'm on the 11th floor of a high-rise building. There's only one way in, and the door has a strong deadbolt lock. Whenever I come in, I quickly close and lock the door due to my pets, so I knew there was no one physically inside with me. I'm a bit startled, but I brush it off as a scare tactic. I bet like 6 in 10 guys right now are wearing a black shirt. The man just seemed like a lonely troll, and I'm sure he was doing this to everyone who fell trapped to his Craigslist scheme. I closed my computer and went on with my evening. Flash forward another 2 days. I'm back sitting at my computer as usual, when once again, the same guy messages me. I already know it's going to be nonsense, so I'm going to do a mark as read /delete so he cannot see that I read it. I see the partial message that says, "black and red globe." I literally scoot my chair back and stare at my computer. Right behind me, I'm sure reflecting in my screen if the light would have hit it correctly, sat a globe with black water and red land. A friend got it for me because it was different. I understood the reference right away. This man obviously had access to my webcam. I then thought back to my original email. He penetrated my picture firewall, and he somehow tied my fake email to my real name. I'm pretty good with computers, but I'm the first to take note when I'm dealing with someone who is a genius with computers. This man gave off every vibe that he knew what he was doing in the computing world, and maybe even the hacking world. I slam my laptop shut, pace around the room, mumbling critical comments to myself about how I'd been so careless to get in a position like this. I run to a drawer and scramble for the black electrical tape. I find some and place it over my cam. I'm officially freaked out at this point. I'm not a tough guy by any means, although I hold my own in most situations. But this felt out of control. I delete my Facebook account and every other social media account as well. I spend the next 10 minutes privatizing my online presence and cleaning out my computer. I keep the tape on and try to get on with my week. When the next day, I get home at around 6 p.m. I enter my apartment, close the door, and greet my pets. That's when I see a white piece of paper that had been slid underneath my door while I was away. This usually either meant maintenance had a project going on, we were late on rent, or the elevators were broken. I pick the note up and see that it says, "Blue doormat." To give you some background, during a drunken escapade, my ex and I bought a bright blue doormat that we were both 100% certain was green and would match the green carpet outside our door. When we both sobered up the next morning, we realized just how off we were and decided to keep it as a joke. This man had been inside my building, at my door. Now, the thing is, is that this is a big building. Dozens of apartments. You would need to know the building number, address, floor number, and my apartment number to find it. My dog wasn't going crazy, but I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a knife. I swung the main closet doors open, finding nothing. I run to my bedroom, swing those closet doors open. Once again, nothing there. I race to the bathroom, pull back the shower curtain. Again, nothing. The man hadn't been inside, but he'd been just on the other side of my door. I'm not the type to call the police, but I felt like I didn't know what to do. After sleeping on it, I call 911 the next day, ask for non-emergency. After a hold, I'm connected to a lady and tell her what's going on. She says she can't do anything, but gives me the number to the police of the city where the man lived. I call and speak to an officer, and basically tell him I'm not trying to press charges or anything, but can someone please go over there and scare him or something? I could tell the cop wanted nothing to do with me, but I kept his ear. Probably because he could hear a rational young man basically pleading with him to help. He ultimately said that he would send someone out there. I get a call a few hours later from the station. The cop I spoke to before says there was no answer at the door. He told me he went to speak to the leasing office, and the property manager said that the only person who lived there was an older woman who had been there forever. I froze for a moment. The guy wasn't even at the apartment when I came there. I started to think, could he have been in a different apartment? Was he waiting outside in a car, behind a tree somewhere in the courtyard? I personally think that he was somewhere inside a neighboring apartment, just watching the whole scene play out. The cop told me to reactivate my account and wait for another message. I did that for a month or so, before shutting it down for good and making another one. I just felt more comfortable that way. I've never had another encounter, and have since moved and gotten a new computer. I got the courage to go up to that apartment twice. The first time, I didn't get a response when I knocked. The second time, I was greeted by an older woman, similar to what the cop had told me. I told her what happened, and she assured me she had no sons or nephews or anything like that would be behind it. She left me with a lecture telling me to be safe. Like I said at the beginning, this unfolded more than 12 years ago now. I look back at my 21-year-old self and wonder what the hell I was doing. I would never, ever consider meeting someone online like that now. And while I know now that it's even more popular of a way to find partnership, I encourage everyone to realize that if it seems sketchy, it is sketchy. Don't put yourself in the same position, or worse, that I did to myself. So back in 2012, my then girlfriend and I went on a big year-long road trip through the States, working on farms along the way for room and board, before ending our trip by driving across Canada, west to east, before ultimately arriving back in Nova Scotia, where we lived. At some point during this journey, we got a puppy, and around the time we got to Alberta, with an extra mouth to feed, we decided that money was running low. Since I'm a carpenter, we decided to find a place to rent, and I would get a job for a few months before we kept going on our trip. We scrolled through Kijiji, which is the Canadian alternative to Craigslist, if you didn't know. We eventually found an ad for a place to rent. This guy lived in a cool-looking house all by himself, just a short drive from the place where I'd found a job. He wanted someone to move in with him, to help with the bills. We started corresponding with him a bit by email, told him I was going to work in the area, and my girlfriend would be staying home with the puppy. Being desperate, and having become accustomed to trusting strangers throughout this long trip, we agreed to send him a deposit and take him up on his offer. We got to his place a few days later. It was in the middle of nowhere, and there were no neighbors. But we'd known that going into the situation. He was about 30, maybe 35 years old, small framed, and he looked like a regular working country dude. Except, I found his facial expressions and mannerisms rather weird. He had this almost perpetual look of fright on his face, almost like he looked ashamed of himself, though he had a dog of his own that he would never allow inside. Keep in mind, this is the cold Canadian North. Right away, when he met us at the door, I felt that there was something off about him. It made me uneasy, especially since I'd be heading off to go to work every day, leaving my girlfriend alone with this creepy guy. But she didn't seem worried, and I didn't want to be controlling, so I did my best to let it go. The first night we were there, he wanted to have a few drinks with us, get to know us. We obliged politely, and he brought a few cans of shitty watery beer out and meekly drank his while sitting across the kitchen table from us. We tried to relax the situation, asked him some friendly questions about himself, but his answers were brief and quiet. He seemed to want friendship, but also seemed completely unsure of how to get it. He went over a few rules that he had. Number 1 was that we stayed out of his room, which was obviously fine. Number 2 was that we not go into the basement. I'll admit, with no further explanation, that rule in and of itself is rather weird. Finally, number 3 was that we stay away from the barn. By this point, I could imagine the news headlines already. Nova Scotian couple found murdered, bound in barn. After this interaction, I didn't sleep very much that night. I wasn't supposed to start work for a couple of days, so I just stayed up reading and playing with our pup. I heard his truck pull out of the driveway pretty early in the morning, and that's when I beelined it for the basement. It was a pretty bare setup, just a washing machine and dryer, along with some folded up lawn chairs. There was a closet near the edge of the room. I'm not familiar with basements having closets. While I didn't know what I was going to find inside of it, my curiosity wasn't going to let me walk away from it. I opened that door up, found a weird nurse's costume that looked as if it was marketed for sexual purposes, along with a roll of duct tape, a set of handcuffs, a shotgun, and a box of shells, all sitting neatly together on the same shelf. Without any pause, I walked myself back upstairs, woke my girlfriend up from her slumber, explained that she no longer had a say in the matter, and that we were leaving before he got home. Once in our car and many miles away from the property, we sent him a message saying that a family member had taken ill, and we were moving back home. He never offered to return our deposit money. In fact, he never even responded to the message. And since that point, we had no more contact with him. A dozen years later, and I'm still waiting to see him in the news. My ex thinks that I'm a worrier, although her parents thank me profusely. While I'm not particularly proud of this story, enough time has passed that I'm not as self-conscious about sharing it. So here goes. In early 2014, I was 18 years old and started browsing the world of Craigslist. Being bored this one day, I responded to an ad in the personal section and started texting this woman. Being 18 and unfamiliar with how Craigslist works, I didn't see an issue with meeting up with her at a Red Roof Inn. I also didn't see anything wrong with her asking for donations. I figured donation meant optional. Stupid, I know, but just to be clear, she never mentioned a price. nor did I tell her that I had money for her. So I set up a time to meet her. I left my house to head to my GED class as usual, but instead of heading directly to the school, I walked to the Red Roof Inn instead. It was pouring rain out, but it was warm, so by the time I arrived, I was both drenched and sweaty. I knocked on the room door that she was in, and she answered. Her attire at the door should have alerted me, but I'm going to say it again. 18 and stupid. She invited me in, and I asked if it'd be okay if I used her shower real quick. She said no problem. So I begin to get undressed in the bathroom, start to hop in the shower, when I see her at the doorway, beginning to take her top off. I told her, "That's okay, I won't be long." So she goes and waits on the bed, watching the Steve Wilkos show, which, thinking back, could have been yet another red flag added to the mound that I didn't already see. I get out of the shower, wrap a towel around my waist, come out of the bathroom randy as a dog, looked at her and asked if she was ready. She sprawled herself out on the bed and says, "Donations are due up front." At this point, all of those red flags that should have gone off did, as I realized more about the situation that I was in. My face dropped as I faced the TV. That's when I nervously told her that I didn't have any money. She instantly got up, started screaming at me, threw both my clothes and my bag in my face. I hurriedly got dressed and actually apologized for wasting her time before slinking out of the room. As I'm leaving this rundown motel, I begin to walk my route towards my GED class. But before I made my way out of the parking lot, a guy in a green Volkswagen Bug calls me over to him. I tried my best to ignore him, given the fact that not only was I embarrassed about the situation, but I was in a rough part of town, and I didn't really feel the need to converse with anyone. This went well, until he shouted to get my attention. This broke my nerve, so I walk up to the driver's side of this guy's car, and he begins talking to me. Now, I'm going to say up front, this guy looks sketchy, and connecting dots, I figure that he's this woman's pimp. He's talking to me with his left arm up on his door, and his right arm down at his side, clearly holding a pistol. At this point, I'm almost certain that I'm going to be shot. He says to me, "So, why would you come here knowing you don't have any money?" I explained as calmly and as politely as I could that I wasn't aware of the situation. That's when this guy pulls his arm up a little to show me the gun clearer before saying, "I have messages between you and her saying you had money for her." Now, like I said earlier, I never told this woman that I had any money. That's when this guy decides to lower his gun and all but whispers to me, "You're lucky you came to see one of my girls. Other girls would have stabbed you with a broken crack pipe. Now, I see you're pretty young, so I'll let you off with a warning this time. But it won't be the same if I catch you doing this again." He then motioned me to be on my way, but you bet your ass, I kept looking back to make sure I wasn't about to be shot from behind. This is the story of my first and last ever time attempting to hook up with somebody on Craigslist. I may have been stupid, but I didn't need to learn this lesson more than once. With everything that has changed between then and now, I don't even know if Craigslist can be used in this sort of manner. But regardless of that, I wouldn't recommend it anyway. Don't be like me. Quick backstory. I work at a gas station on a main route, and we see a lot of travelers passing through. Only one person works each shift, and it's a 24-hour store. We're short-staffed, so I agreed to an overnight, something that I'm not too fond of doing. But extra money? I'll take that. I'm a female, and I work in a state that's always had self-serve gas stations. So late this night, when a guy comes in. I ask him if he needed any help. He says no, he's just getting gas at the pump, but needs to use the restroom. I give him the key and go back to work on whatever invoices we got that day. The guy uses the bathroom, returns the key, and then heads back outside. When after about 5, maybe 7 minutes later, he comes back in the store and tells me that he's confused about the pump. He directly says, "You might have to come outside to help me." This is something that customers don't often say. They usually just complain that the pump isn't working. So I've already got a weird feeling about this guy. I shake it off because, visually, he looks like a nerd, and I don't feel afraid of him. I look at my register to see what error the pump came up with. But there are no errors. The register doesn't even say that the pump was in use. Even if someone tries to pay and nothing's wrong with their payment, the monitor will say, "Payment or loyalty timed out." But there was no sign of him even trying to use it before asking me for help. I ask him if he just wants to pay inside. He agrees to this, goes and grabs his wallet out of the car, and then comes back to slap down $10 on the counter. I give him his receipt, and once again he says, "Can you come out and help me? I don't understand the machine." I say, "We aren't really allowed to leave the store during overnight shifts, as it's just me here, and it's not safe to leave the store." Looking back, I don't know why I told him I was alone. But again, he didn't seemingly appear threatening. He proceeds to say, "I don't understand what it's asking me. I need help. I mean, I'm not scary or anything." I tell him again that I can't go outside. It's store policy for the overnight shift. And say, "It's not that you're scary. I just can't leave. I would have to tell a little old lady asking for help at this hour the same exact thing." Which is true. We're not even allowed to take out the trash during overnight shifts. He starts to walk away from the register counter, but then again stops at the door and asks me one final time to come outside and help him. Now, I'm pretty annoyed at this point. I've said no twice now. I'm not going, so stop asking. In a super annoyed tone, I break down all the steps he needs to follow in order to fill up his tank, before ending the statement with, "I'm not going outside." After this exchange, he finally leaves the store and heads back to his car. The register then tells me that he had no trouble pumping gas. At this point, I'm watching him on the cameras to make sure that there's not any issue. I'm not 100% sure because there's no audio in our surveillance system, but it looked as if he were speaking to someone in the rear seat of his car. Not full-on conversational style, but slyly and on the hush. We have multiple cameras around the property, so as I clicked on different ones to show me other angles, I didn't see any passengers in his car at all. So now I know one of two things. Either he is full-on, out loud talk to himself crazy, or he had someone potentially lying in his back seat, fully concealed. Neither one of those options are very inviting. Normally, a person such as this walking in and having problems at the pump wouldn't give me such an issue, but the accumulative weirdness of it all definitely stood out. Opting to ask me to go outside instead of bringing in money at 3 a.m. is weird enough, but add in how he didn't bother to use the pump before he came inside to ask for help, claiming that it wasn't working, and then not taking my first no for an answer only adds to the strangeness. When he pulled off, I thought that I should write down his license plate, just in case anything else out of the norm were to happen. But to my surprise, the car had a black garbage bag wrapped around the rear plate, making it virtually unreadable. Not sure what he or they were planning, whether it was a robbery, abduction, or something more. But I'm forever glad to not have walked blindly into whatever their trap was. Hey everybody, if you'd like to directly support us as a channel, please consider joining our Patreon. Your support allows me to dedicate more time and effort into creating the content that you enjoy. And by becoming a patron, you'll be able to interact with me directly, be listed within our content as a backer, assist with content creation, and even gain early access to all of our upcoming releases. Find me at patreon.com/Malevolent Mischief, or simply click the link in the description. I look forward to bringing you even more creepy and unsettling content. Now, let's get back to the stories. About a decade ago now, I was in my final semester of college. I worked at a department store in the mall. I didn't have a car yet, so I asked for solely day shifts, because taking public transport, it's 2 hours both to and from home. So basically, if I had a closing shift, I'd get done at 11 p.m., but I wouldn't walk through my front door until 1 a.m. This wasn't a perfect system, as there were occasions where I would get closing shifts, much to my annoyance, as most of my days started with the 6:45 a.m. class. This would cause my mother to worry, because who wants their kid on public transport that late? There were times when she could come get me, and that was much appreciated, although I did realize that it was a bit of a hassle to get my younger sisters out that late as well, so I'd feel guilty for requesting it of my mom. My managers, being the jerks that they were, gave me a week straight of closing shifts, fully knowing my situation. I was pissed, but whatever, I needed that paycheck. One night, I had just finished my shift, gotten on the bus, and was minding my business when my iPod died. I was annoyed, but I kept my earbuds in, tried to occupy myself by playing a crossword on my phone. About 2 seats behind me, I hear these 2 men speaking Spanish. Now, my stepmother is Puerto Rican, so while I understand a fair bit of Spanish, I don't really speak it. I hear them talking, but I don't really pay attention because it's rude to eavesdrop and all. Until they say, "That girl up there." This perks my ears up. I keep my earbuds in, that way they think that I can't hear them, but I continue listening. What they're saying is horrific. To paraphrase, they knew my stop, the second to last one, before the bus gets back to the terminal. And while my stop is at the front of my neighborhood, there are no real streetlights, and at this time of night, it's pretty much empty. To put it simply, they were planning on, quote, snatching that piece of ass up. I was about 20 minutes from home, so I knew that I had to act quickly. Since I knew they could see me, I pretended that I was simply playing on my phone, oblivious, while I was actually texting my mom. "Mom, can you please meet me at the bus stop?" 5 minutes go by, no answer. We're getting closer to my stop, so I decide to call her cell. No answer. I call the house phone, and thank God she finally answers. It's about 12:30 a.m., so she was clearly asleep. I try to talk as cheerily and calmly as I can. This was our convo. "Hey Mom, did you get my text?" No. What's up?" "Oh, I sent you a picture of these jeans I'm gonna order online when I get home. I really need your opinion, so I'd really appreciate if you went to look at the sale, since it ends at 1 a.m. I'm glad that even half asleep, my mom is sharp as a tack. She gets the hint that I need her to look at her cell phone right now. So I say goodbye and just hope for the best. We get to my stop, and to my joy, I see my mom's car. I quickly gather all my belongings from the seat and hightail it off the bus. I don't even look behind me to see if they're following me. I just jump right into the car and tell my mom to go. As we're pulling off, I peer in the rear view and see these 2 guys standing in the middle of the street, staring at the car. Once we're home, I fully explain the situation to my mom just a little bit better. I'm so thankful that even though she didn't know exactly what was up, she didn't hesitate to just hop in the car and come grab me. The next morning, I called my job and told them that I quit. No more public transport for me. Thanks to my stepmom for teaching me Spanish, and thanks to my mom for getting the hint. This story is from a few years back now. I'm older, more mature, and no longer work for this particular employer. But at the time, I was an employee of Ronald McDonald. I'd been at my Golden Arch location for just over 2 years at this point, minus the 3 months or so that I was on maternity leave. In fact, that leave had just come to an end, and I was now the proud new mother to my son. Just a little background info early on. I've heard it since his birth. My son does not look like me. He much more resembles my husband. That, in addition to the fact that I'm a baby face myself, I often would get mistaken for a babysitter or nanny instead of mom. This specific evening, I had just wrapped up my shift slinging fries and Big Macs when my husband and our now 4-month-old little boy came to pick me up. They came into the dining room, and I took this opportunity to introduce my baby boy to all of my coworkers. We ordered a few meals for dinner, while my coworkers all cooed over my baby at the pickup counter. My husband took this free moment to excuse himself to the restroom. It was about then that I noticed an older man sitting in the dining room, watching us. As a new parent, this is something you deal with pretty regularly. Strangers staring, due to the fact that babies tend to invite attention. Not exactly weird, especially because I recognize this man as someone that frequents our location. But things get weird the moment that he approaches us, smiles at my son, and straight up asks if he could hold him. I politely decline this request when he pulls a $20 bill from his pocket. He says, "Why don't you take this, get yourself a sandwich, and leave the baby with me?" Again, only slightly less polite this time. I say, "No thanks." At this point, we had just gotten a new GM at the store. With him present and me wanting to maintain a good impression, I didn't fly off the handle on this strange man practically insisting on taking my baby. When he says, "Aren't you hungry? It's gotta be so hard to work 2 jobs. I'm sure if anything happened, the parents wouldn't blame you." That's when my husband came out of the bathroom and placed himself between the strange man and myself. "Oh, you must be the father." He then turned and offered my husband the money, but didn't talk about taking our son. That's when we as a family decided to make our way out of the store. But the man followed, offering us money the entire way. My husband, finally fed up, stopped on a dime. This caused the old man to run into him, and my husband stared daggers at him until he retreated back into the store. On the way home, I recount to my husband what had happened while he was in the bathroom, to which all he could do was shake his head and say, "What a weirdo." A few weeks later, when I was back on the job, the old man came back into the store. He ranted up and down about how he could have given that baby a better life than that young man. I told him I was the mother, and that he could get his sausage biscuits somewhere else because he wasn't welcome here anymore. The GM, the same one that I had been so worried about maintaining an appearance in front of, instantly stepped in front of the counter and ushered this man out the door, while stating that if he were caught on the property again, he'd be arrested. I'm proud of myself for standing my ground the second time around, and my general manager even lauded me for taking control of the situation. While I no longer work at Mickey D's, I remember my time there fondly. A lot of the customers and my coworkers were kind and sweet people, but there's always that one that you'd be fine never running into again. After a blissful year of living in my very own apartment for the first time alone, a man moved in next door that I will never forget. The layout of my apartment is crucial to convey how this incident unfolded. Not so much where my kitchen or where my bathroom is, but understanding that our balcony and his balcony are only partially separated by a wall. There's a solid 2-foot gap in which you can easily walk from one balcony to another. For context, I previously had a very lovely woman living next door to me for the entire first year that I lived there. This woman never crossed his balcony threshold without being explicitly invited. I only throw this in there so you can understand that I wasn't previously concerned about someone infiltrating my space. The first time I met this new neighbor, he was unloading groceries from his massive truck into the assigned parking spot next to mine. As I was driving up, he and a girl I assumed to be his girlfriend were unloading boxes from Costco. I noticed them speaking, and as soon as I was out of the car, they went silent. I nodded a greeting to them, proceeded to the elevator, and the guy ran up behind me before throwing some boxes down and begging me to wait. No problem. I pride myself in being a good neighbor. While in the elevator, the girlfriend refused to make eye contact or speak to me. A little weird, but I just thought she was shy. Although the guy quickly introduced himself and was extremely chatty. In the 45 seconds that it takes to get from the parking lot to the floor where our apartments were, he asked how I liked the place, where I was from, and where I worked. Looking back, his enthusiasm was a little strange, but I chalked it up to him being excited to be in a new place. For the sake of the rest of the story, let's call the neighbor Sam. Sam was maybe 30, 35, 6 feet tall, with a slim muscular build, and had hair buzzed extremely short, as if he were attempting to mask his balding. Pretty average looking by all accounts, at least in my opinion. The first few weeks we run into each other often, and he always makes some small talk, and always refers to me as Miss. I assume it's because he forgot my name, but still wanted to be polite. I almost never see his girlfriend after that first night, but occasionally I can hear him talking to a lady in his apartment, as the walls in our complex are reasonably thin. One night, after about 3 months since Sam moved in, my boyfriend is spending the night, and we were watching movies on the couch. It's probably around 11:30 p.m. The back of my couch is against the wall that I share with Sam, and we hear some banging noises. My first thought is that him and his girlfriend must be getting it on. Boyfriend and I laugh and turn the volume of the TV up just to drown them out. Then, in addition to the banging, the neighbors begin screaming, and we can hear objects being thrown, glass shattering everywhere. The exact words are muffled, but the tone is angry, and there's a considerable amount of crying going on. My boyfriend, the gem that he is, steps onto the semi-shared balcony and in his loudest voice yells over, without crossing onto Sam's balcony, "Everything okay in there?" The girl opens the sliding glass door on Sam's side a minute or two later and says, "Sorry about that." So we leave it alone. I'm concerned, but we have no idea what actually happened and decide to just go to bed. I wake up around 3 a.m. to more screaming, but my boyfriend, dead asleep, refuses to wake up, and I'm not about to take my 5-foot self to break up whatever is going on at 3 a.m. I considered calling the police, but was so drowsy that I convinced myself that I had possibly dreamt it. I deeply regret that decision. The next morning, I woke up to some terrible personal news, an entirely unrelated death of a friend of mine, and pretty much put the events of that night on the back burner. I didn't forget, but it also wasn't squarely on my mind. Fast forward about 2 weeks. It's a warm day, and I'm outside on my balcony reading a book in a robe, sports bra, and shorts. I'm in my chair that faces away from Sam's apartment, so I can't see his side from where I am. I'm deep in my book, when suddenly I get tapped on the shoulder. Sam is firmly standing behind me, and asks if we can talk for a second. This man has already crossed the invisible line by coming onto my side of the balcony, but I also can't get to my door without physically moving him. so I asked him what's going on. He told me it was his birthday and asked if I knew where to get weed because I seemed like a girl who knows how to have a good time. As we live in a state where weed is legal, I told him that I'm sure Google would provide the best dispensary in the area, but that I personally didn't have any. He proceeds to tell me how drunk he got last night, and at this point, I'm just itching for an exit. As I start to move, as if to signal that I'm done talking, he reaches out for my shoulder and tells me that he hit/scratched my car last night because he was driving, quote, very wasted. He says all of this with a smile on his face, almost laughing. I'm surprised, but mostly want to get away from him because my creep senses are starting to tingle, and I don't want to blow up at him for hitting my car. He says he'll send me his insurance info if I give him my number. Thankfully, I knew that that would be a bad call. I make a bad, nervous joke about knowing where he lived and said if the damage was bad enough, I would knock on his door to get his information. He counters by saying he'll leave a note with his info on my door. That's when he retreats from my balcony, while also saying he'd prefer to just pay me cash and not involve insurance. I give it an hour or so, then I head down to assess the damage. I did this purposefully because I didn't want to walk down at the same time as him or risk having him follow me. Sure enough, there are 2 long new scratches on the driver's side door. They're not deep, just kind of superficial, not exactly worthy of a call to insurance immediately. I really just didn't want to get involved with him in any way, so I decided I could deal with the scratches. But this little event definitely irked me. At this point, I knew that something was off with him. Nothing unusual happens as far as I'm aware of this night. The next day is Saturday, and as I had to work the next day, I'm home alone watching some action-y movie, once again around 11 p.m. I'm on the sofa with my cat curled up on me, and the movie is relatively loud, so it takes me a little while to register this banging noise coming from the hallway. I honestly only noticed because my cat had woken up and got all puffed up and freaked out. I turned down the volume of the film and suddenly realize that the banging is getting louder and louder. Just as I stand up, I hear the 5 words no one wants to hear coming from their door. Open up. It's the police. My stomach all but hit the floor. I had lied to Sam the day before. I totally had weed, and I had smoked a fat joint outside on the balcony, maybe 20 minutes before the knocking began. I'm totally panicked at this point, and trying to control my breathing so I don't immediately come off as suspicious before I answer the door. I remember checking the peephole to see a close-up of a cop's face, then opening the door, coming face to face with 6 officers, all with guns drawn. I'm about 0.5 seconds away from completely pissing my pants in fear, still convinced I'm somehow in trouble for smoking a joint. The officer who seems to be in charge can instantly sense my level of panic and says, "Ma'am, you're not in trouble. We need to speak with you about your neighbor. Would it be alright if we came in?" At this point, I'm reeling and my whole being is tense. I let the cops in, but my heart hasn't moved from my throat. The lead policeman asked me about any interactions that I've had with Sam. I tell him that I barely know him, that he just lives next door to me and only moved in a few months ago. I asked why they needed to be in my apartment. I'm scared, but also I don't always trust cops, and I have the right to know why 6 of them practically waved their guns in my face. He proceeds to tell me that Sam is a bad guy. He apparently beat his girlfriend so badly the night prior that she was now in the ICU for her injuries. The cops also told me Sam's girlfriend said she believed he had a gun and that he was currently using something to barricade himself in the apartment next to mine. Lead officer says he has spoken to my building manager and knew my place had access to his balcony, and they needed to use it in order to arrest Sam. I'm probably visibly shaking at this point as fear courses through me. Next, they asked me to go into my bedroom, lock the door, turn the lights off. I comply. The next 30 to 45 minutes were absolute hell. In my panic, I had left my cell phone on the kitchen counter and had to sit in my room just listening to the commotion. No shots were ever fired, but there was a lot of yelling and what sounded like things being thrown. Eventually, after what felt like a lifetime, the main officer knocked on my door and told me that Sam had been arrested, and he thanked me for letting them use my apartment. They asked me questions for maybe 15 more minutes before showing themselves the exit. I wish this is where the story ended, but there is a bit more. In the days following Sam's arrest, I became even more panicked about him coming back to the apartment building, worried about retaliation. I hadn't said anything to the police, anything that would technically incriminate him, but I had told them about the night my boyfriend and I heard them fight. About 5 days later, Sam reappeared at the building as I was coming home from work one evening. He tried to approach me, but the elevator door shut just as he was running to catch it. My whole body was tense once again, like that feeling you have when you come this close to getting into a car accident, yet narrowly avoid it. I stayed off my balcony entirely from this point on, and always kept the curtains closed. Sam and I didn't speak, or really even see each other at all for another few weeks, before we had our final interaction. Sam stopped me in the parking lot one night, running after me as I was once again about to get on the elevator. He begged me to tell him why I let the cops in that night. I told him the honest truth, that I was stoned, didn't know what to do, and had a bad history with cops. This is all true, and again, I was still concerned about him trying to retaliate towards me. He then got pretty upset, kept trying to repeat the question, obviously wanting a different answer. When I couldn't give him one, he then plain out offered me $3,000 to testify as a character witness on his behalf, because I, quote, knew him and knew how he really treated women. I was speechless and beyond freaked out. He told me his hearing was next Thursday morning, and he asked if I could show up. I was like a deer frozen in headlights for a moment, and then somehow got the hell out of there, after mumbling a string of words that were most likely incoherent. The Wednesday night before his trial, I came home from work and found my cat acting rather strangely, like something had just spooked her. I kind of shook it off, but I noticed through the curtains there was something taped to the outside of my sliding glass door. Apparently, Sam had left a note with his phone number and name, along with the phrase, "I'm counting on you." Needless to say, I didn't show up at his court date. I took a photo of the note, grabbed my cat, locked all my doors, and stayed at my mom's house for about a week after this happened. I did phone the police to let them know that he had been on my balcony again, but they never followed up with anything. Eventually, my boyfriend came and we went back to my place together. Everything was just as it should have been. I never saw Sam again, but a few weeks later, a lady I'd never seen before was cleaning out his apartment. A day or so after this, I ran into my building manager and had a chat with him about Sam, in an attempt to discover if Sam had been evicted or see if he had gone to jail. The manager disclosed that his girlfriend pulled through. I never knew her name, so I couldn't follow up with trying to see if she was okay with local hospitals, plus HIPAA and all. The manager told me verbatim that they had made an exception for Sam to break his lease, but that he wouldn't confirm whether or not that was because Sam was in jail. About a month after this, new people moved into the apartment, and things have been normal ever since. I tried calling the police and the county jail to see if Sam was in lockup, but no one was able to release information to me. I'm hoping that that means he's there, especially if he did what the police said he did. This story happened to me in the early hours of New Year's Day this year. To give you a bit of context, I'm a male in my early 20s, and I live in an apartment on the second floor. I come back home from a New Year's Eve party at around 6 a.m. I get undressed, text a couple of people to let them know I've made it home, and then head straight to bed. All of this in a span of 10 to 15 minutes. But as soon as I get into bed, I hear my doorbell ring. For what it's worth, it's not my actual door, but the gate to the apartment complex. Initially, I say fuck it. It must be a drunk person, or someone pulling a prank, or being an asshole. So I let it ring. But whoever it is down there keeps ringing very insistently. After about 5, maybe 10 minutes of this, I get up in my boxers to answer the phone that is wired to the gate. I answer the phone and I hear a foreign-sounding man. He's either muffling his voice or simply not enunciating. But from what I gather, he's trying to tell me something about a friend and keys to let him in the complex. I let it register for a moment before I tell him, I don't know you. I'm not opening the gate. I slam the receiver down and head back to bed again. But without pause, they just keep ringing. I get up again, go answer the phone, this time more than just a wee bit angry, and I'm greeted by a girl speaking perfect English, which in and of itself, a little odd because I live in Italy. She's telling me in a very clear manner that she's staying on the 5th floor. Her friend has the keys, that she's a woman alone in the street, and for me to come check it at the door if I don't believe her. She sounded very convincing if I'm being honest. Mind you, in this moment, I'm still coming down from a drink-filled night. Probably still have the remnants of a leafy green substance in my blood, and very tired. I'm doing my best to weigh my options. What if she really is a girl alone in the street at 6 a.m., out in the cold, and with all the drunk people going around? But then I think, what if she isn't though? Fortunately, even in my mildly intoxicated state, I have the idea to go out on my balcony, the one that faces over the gate, and check out who's on the street. I throw on my parka because it's pretty cold, and I'm not heading out to my balcony just in my boxers. But once I get out there, I have an absolute f*** you moment. I see that there are 5 people down at the gate. It looks as if it's 4 men and 1 girl if I saw correctly. They're standing right in front of the entryway, talking quietly between themselves. And that's when I yell out at them, "Oi, you wanted to come in?" Before immediately heading inside to call the police, while also grabbing a knife. The real scary thing here is that the entryway gate is not see-through. So if I had gone downstairs to check it out, I wouldn't have been able to see outside. But as soon as I would have opened the door, I likely would have been overpowered by them, and then forced to lead them to my apartment. The story more or less ends there. The fuckers kept ringing the bell for what I'd say was another 15 minutes, while I turned off all the lights in my apartment and walked room to room like some drunken Rambo with a knife in my hand, periodically checking all the windows. I have windows that face the internal portion of our complex courtyard. My windows that face the street can easily be climbed up to, or so I thought at that moment. And then, just as quickly as it started, it all ended. I don't know if the police saw anyone or came out at all, because I never heard from them. And once all this activity died down, I ended up just passing out in bed for a few solid hours. When I woke up later, it really resonated with me just how weird this whole thing was. What if I hadn't had a second thought about buzzing them in? What if I didn't peek over my balcony? What if I had taken the step to go downstairs and visually confirm that it was just a girl out there? I guess the best case scenario would be I'd be out a lot of my physical possessions. Worst case? Well, I don't really want to think about the worst case. I share this story as a reminder to always think one step ahead. Maybe it's not the best idea to just take people at their word's value. And while it may be annoying in the moment, there's no problem with letting a phone remain unanswered. Last year, my fiance and my mother passed away, one right after the other. After they died, I obviously fell into a deep depression. Though I thought I was pulling off the whole "I'm fine" thing, my friends could clearly see through it. A close friend of mine almost demanded I move in with her and get out of the apartment that I shared with my fiance for 10 years. She wanted me to start fresh, and while I didn't think I was ready to move on, the idea of not living alone was appealing. Plus, her apartment is in a much nicer neighborhood than the one I was currently living in, so I agreed. Living with her has been fantastic. Our schedules are opposite. Me on days, her on nights. So we both get alone time, but we also have at least one day a week off together, so we get to hang out. Moving has also allowed me to be able to walk to work as it's so close. I thought that would be a godsend, until my 10-minute walk caused a 2-month-long nightmare. I decided to sit in the park that's between my apartment and my job one evening after work. As I'm sitting there, a man approached me. I saw his face first. He was almost handsome, if not a little rough looking. Even though I live in an urban area with a high homeless population, it didn't occur to me that this man was anything but a mildly handsome 40-something guy. So I smiled and looked back down at my phone, expecting him to walk on by. Nope. He asked me what time it was. When I looked up to tell him, I noticed all the stuff that he was carrying. It was so random. A kid's chalkboard with nonsense all over it, a paper bag full of old magazines and paperwork, and a steel shelf that at one point would have held CDs on it. I then noticed that he wasn't wearing shoes, and his hands were absolutely filthy. Needless to say that it finally dawned on me that this was not going to be a normal encounter. He started talking nonstop, some of it nonsense, but some coherent. All of it f***ing crazy. Of the parts I could follow, he told me he had just been released from prison, and he was looking for a tattoo shop because he wanted to get the DOC, the Department of Corrections, and 34, the number of DOC violations he had while in prison, tattooed on him, and he wanted the DOC to pay for it. He then noticed a button I had on my bag that had the logo for a local gay bar on it. He told me he had gone in there one night and went home with a guy. Then he looked me up and down and said, "But young ladies are my problem." I gathered my stuff and left immediately. Now, I love this apartment that I'm staying in, but it has its drawbacks which became glaringly obvious after this encounter. The apartment is on the first floor. I love it because you can walk out the sliding glass doors, one in the living room and one in my bedroom, right onto an awesome gated patio that has tables and grills for barbecuing, so it's awesome in the summer. I now hate it because it's right on the street, and the fencing is clearly very easy to scale. One very early morning, around 5 a.m., I hear a man scream, "What the f*** are you doing?" So loud and so close, it woke me up from a dead sleep. I legitimately thought it was coming from inside my bedroom. As it turned out, it was coming from outside. A neighbor of mine had been leaving for work and discovered a man, you guessed it, the same man from the park, sleeping against my sliding glass door. The dude got scared off. My neighbor checked on me, and once I calmed down, I chalked it up as a f***ed up coincidence. Well, 2 weeks later, I was sleeping, and at some point this man came onto the patio and was now tapping on my sliding glass door. I just laid there, frozen in fear. That is, until he escalated to full-blown kicking the glass. I flipped on my light to grab my phone, and that's when he took off. I called the police, and they came over to take a report and to look at the footage from the cameras in the building. The footage confirmed that it was the man from the park, and even more disturbingly, The footage from the hallway cameras showed that on more than one occasion, he had slipped into the building behind a resident and sat in the lobby for several hours. Even at one point, going down the hallway and trying my doorknob and my neighbor's doorknob to see if they were locked. He even went so far as to hide in the little mailbox room when he saw my roommate coming in from work. The police think he either followed me from the park or just happened to notice me at one point when I was on the patio. It's been a few weeks since this occurred, and I haven't seen him, and no one has reported seeing him in or around the building. My roommate bought me pepper spray, and my kinda kooky, albeit well-meaning neighbor, who has made it very clear he's retired military and a bit of a gun nut, checks on me nightly, so I'm not as freaked out as I could be. But still, it's wild when you move to a neighborhood that you think is safer than the one you're coming from, only to realize that's far from the situation. This happened to my husband and myself almost a decade ago, late November, and it still gives us chills to this day. While living in Seattle, my husband and I would frequently go surfing. Usually, we drive out to Nia Bay or Westport, but on this particular weekend, the surf report looked pretty messy for spots located directly on the coast. We decided instead to try hitting some spots along the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The land along the strait is beautiful, but remote. You can only access it by driving all along Highway 112, which runs from Port Angeles to Nia Bay. There's no cell service along almost all of Highway 112, and only in a smattering of small towns. So we decided to try surfing along the strait at this one spot, Twin. We'd surfed out there before and had a good lay of the land. The report showed that the waves would be best in the early morning, so we opted to drive out the evening before and then sleep in our car overnight. Since it was late November, we decided to forego paying for a camping spot at a nearby campground and just figured that we'd park somewhere along the beach at Twin. We figured there would be no one there, and we were right. We arrived in the afternoon around 3:30 p.m., and the only other people parked were a young couple in their Westphalia. Nothing terribly eventful occurred between our arrival and nightfall. We got there, cooked some dinner, and I took a quick walk along the beach. The only other thing of note that occurred was just before sunset, when we heard this loud whistling, and then saw some guy who'd been walking along the highway come down the entrance road towards the beach. My husband and I thought it was pretty fucking odd, given that there's absolutely nowhere you can easily walk along that highway. All he had with him was a tiny backpack, so he definitely wasn't hiking. He said hello to the young couple as he walked along the beach, and they invited him to hang out by their campfire for a while. Last time we saw any of them that evening was when my husband and I decided to call it a night and go to sleep. This was just after 7 p.m. I woke up about an hour later and opened the car door a bit to get some fresh air. That's when I noticed that the couple's Westphalia was now gone, and something about them being gone just unnerved me. I couldn't put a logical finger on why, so I chalked up my feelings to just being tired, and I laid back down. When I next awoke, it was close to 11 p.m., and this time, I shot up so quickly that my husband woke up alongside me. He asked what was wrong. I instinctively said nothing, just that I woke up startled. He seemed completely relaxed and fell right back to sleep. But I stayed up for about 15 minutes trying to listen for anything that I might have heard. In hindsight, I think my intuition was screaming to me that something was off. Since I didn't hear anything, I laid back down and really tried to focus on getting some sleep. About 20 minutes later, I woke up again, but this time, my husband was already up. He was sitting silently, clearly listening. Him sitting so still freaked me out, so I turned on the interior car lights and asked him what was up. He whispered, "Someone was just tapping on the windows." I remember feeling this deep sense of dread. That's when I tell him, "When I woke up a few hours ago, I noticed that the couple in their van had left. There's no one else camping here." At that, we both put our shoes on, grabbed our flashlights, along with a knife, pepper spray, and opened the doors. Total silence met with pitch black darkness. My husband started up towards the trees behind us to look around, while I stood by our car and shined a light down onto the beach. I saw no one and sat on the back bumper while he continued to look. I checked in vain to see if I had cell service. Nothing. Maybe 2 minutes later he returned, walking fast. As he passed me, he whispered with a sense of urgency, "We need to leave. There's a car parked up by the exit road. It's just sitting there with the lights off, but the ignition on. I couldn't tell if there was anyone inside." In no more than a minute, we threw everything in the front seats into the back where we'd been sleeping, started up the car, and started driving back up towards the entrance road. We did this because we didn't want a chance taking the exit road and driving by that car. We peeled out of that lot fast, but in a moment of disorientation, my husband turned the wrong way and started driving down the highway towards Nia Bay. As we began going the wrong way, we drove past the exit road and, lo and behold, there was the car, now with its lights on. A few seconds later, we both noticed that the car was speeding up behind us. I practically screamed, "What the fuck are you doing? There's basically nowhere to turn around." The highway is narrow, with a forest on one side and the ocean on the other. Luckily, we saw a small turnout coming up. I remember my husband repeatedly saying, "Fuck," obviously voicing his discomfort in the situation, before cutting hard to the left. And as soon as we cut left, the person or people following us just kept on in the same direction. We took off back down the highway going like 90 back towards Port Angeles. No one followed us the rest of the way back. I still feel deeply creeped out when thinking about the intentions of whoever was in that car. We still go on the occasional surfing venture every now and again, but now we exclusively stick to the campgrounds. No more car camping for us. I happen to live in a small rural community in the eastern United States. It's a nice little town. Because of my work in the medical field, I've met some interesting folks. I'm also familiar with law enforcement and other emergency personnel. Small town life isn't as dull and uneventful as people think, especially since everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I have a lot of stories to share, but since this one just happened, I'll start here. Because it's very recent and the investigation is still ongoing, I have to be vague with some details, but I needed to tell someone. I'm single and live alone, and due to a stalker, I've moved twice, but that's another story for another time. However, it is relevant for this story for multiple reasons. The first reason being that I have a dog for the sake of protection, as well as having motion sensors and outdoor security cameras. The second reason being the location of my home, which is literally down the street from the fire department and a couple blocks from the police station. However, next to the fire department is the road department, which is basically a parking lot where they park their road equipment and empty garbage trucks at night and on weekends. Oddly, this lot doesn't have a security camera. Small town life, I suppose. My house sits on a hill with a good view of that side of the street. Due to the incline, the large trees in the front yard, and the half cornfield on the property next to me, most people in the street below wouldn't notice me in the backyard unless they were actively looking. However, I can see the street clearly. This incident happened a few Saturdays ago. The county was holding its annual Independence Day spiel with a community barbecue, music, fireworks, etc. I didn't attend because it's just not my thing. Plus, my dog and the sound of fireworks don't really go together. Before the big show, I took the dog out to relieve herself in the backyard. There was still at least an hour of daylight, but the entire neighborhood was pretty quiet because most everyone was at the fairgrounds or various other holiday events. So when an unfamiliar, large white pickup truck drove slowly down my street, I noticed it. It must have turned around at the end of the street because I saw it again, moving in the opposite direction, only about 20 seconds later. This time, it turned into the parking lot of the road department. Now, people have been known to toss things into the empty garbage trucks, usually at night, to avoid getting caught, because they don't want to / are unable to make the trip to the landfill themselves. Usually, it's things like furniture or broken equipment, but I didn't see any of those things in the back of this truck. The driver was a somewhat stocky guy, looking to be of average height. He took 3 large black trash bags from the bed of his truck and tossed them one by one into the hopper of the garbage truck, before turning around, hopping back into his truck, and leaving. Now, I swear I'm not one of those meddling rear window types who always thinks activity is suspicious and that their neighbors are up to no good. But something about this didn't sit right with me. Normally, when I see people tossing their garbage into the trucks and leaving, I don't bother reporting it because it's relatively harmless. But this time, I had a gut feeling that I just wasn't going to ignore. So I called the police. If anything, they could get the guy for illegally dumping trash from a barbecue or whatever it was. While I'm on the phone with dispatch, I put my dog inside to cut down on possible distractions for when the officers arrive and begin to investigate. A few minutes later, an officer arrived and I crossed the street to meet him. I gave him a description of the events and pointed out which of the trucks the man had tossed the bags into. He found the bags, took photos, put gloves on, and told me to stay back. The bags were tied in a knot at the top, and it took him a minute to untie one because of the gloves and how tight the knot was. But eventually, he got it open, looked inside for no more than a few seconds, before twisting it closed and taking a few steps back. "Shit," I heard him say under his breath. "What?" I asked. "It's a body." Immediately, I felt sick. I could tell that he felt sick too. I saw him grow pale. His hand was even trembling when he held the radio. His voice was shaking as he gave the code to dispatch. The dispatcher sounded confused when she asked him to repeat it. But within 10 minutes, the county sheriff was on the scene. Even he looked sick at the contents of the bag. The coroner arrived 10 minutes after that, and the initial officer walked me back to my house along with another one who arrived at the same time as the coroner. My surveillance camera caught footage of the truck as it drove by both times, as well as pulling into the parking lot, though unfortunately not a clear view of the license plate or of the man tossing the bags out of frame. We watched the footage over and over, pausing frames, the officers taking notes. Ultimately, they requested this footage as well as a copy of the files from the past week to see if the truck had been in the area before. I was also directed to save footage until the road department installs their own cameras this week. Because this is still fresh, I don't have many more details. I do know that the body was, quote, in pieces, but I don't know the age of the victim, the gender, cause of death, anything like that. Information hasn't been released to the public. I don't know if the coroner has even been able to identify the body yet. A police cruiser has been parked at the fire department next door for constant surveillance, just in case the guy comes back again. The guy who dumped the body was likely a local. How else would he know that he could have dumped there? he no doubt thought that those bags would get buried in other people's illegal trash that accumulated over the holiday weekend, and that the sanitation crew wouldn't have bothered to investigate. When I think about how this guy most likely lives in my community, it makes me feel physically ill. To think that he had clearly scouted the area for a dump site, that it may not have been the first time that this had happened, that this could happen again. If I hadn't called it in, if I hadn't been in the backyard at that exact moment, or if I had ignored my gut feeling, the victim may never have been found, may never find potential justice, and their loved ones may never have closure. In fact, it seems that there's a real possibility that this might just happen again, only to another poor soul. I think it might be time that I moved again. Third time's a charm, right? So this happened earlier this year. As a little background, I'm a 30-year-old male, married, with a young daughter. I live in a rural Northern California town, pretty much right at the epicenter of the gold rush. And I don't know if it's all the ways the land was taken or the ways people killed for wealth back then, but it's always seemed to have a higher share of strange recluses and sovereign citizen types. That being said, this isn't a haunting story or strange people of the woods story, but it was by far the most frightening encounter I've ever experienced as a father. Some time ago, I ended up with an extra day off, and my wife and I decided to go for a drive and check out a semi-local gun show. From time to time, I will get tables at them and have friends who do them regularly, so we went to visit, as I'm always looking for obscure parts and pieces for old military weapons. Plus, I had some family that lived in the area of this show too. We had a hell of a winter last year, so unsurprisingly, it was a cold, gloomy day. We drove about an hour to get to the show and knew the promoters, so we walked right in. As I was passing tables in search of the right stuff, I was carrying my daughter with me. She's very small and ridiculously cute, so everyone wanted to look and ask about her, which is pretty normal from what I've observed for parents. At times, you even draw a small crowd, usually of sweet little old ladies and even some grandpa types. As a side point, I had one grumpy lady telling me my daughter was way too young for this type of show. I looked at her confused and said, "She's like 3 months old. She's never going to remember this." But back on topic. There was one man who seemed a bit more excited than most men his age, but he said that he had worked as an EMT and in the NICU for years, so it seemed reasonable that he was so happy to see healthy babies. As the afternoon went on, he passed us a few more times, moving against the crowd, and he even commented on how beautiful she was, once to me, once to my wife. As babies often do at that age, my wife soon needed to breastfeed our daughter. We went out to the car and had blinders in the back seat so she could have some privacy and keep the baby from distractions. I turned on the heater, locked the doors, and went back inside to help a buddy sell during a busier point in the show. About 10 to 15 minutes later, my phone starts ringing with my frantic wife on the other end. No more than 3 minutes before, I had noticed that law enforcement had gotten up and walked outside the show. It took a minute to calm my wife down, but apparently, that same overeager guy had followed us outside and had been watching closely. While feeding our baby, my wife got that sudden feeling that makes your hair stand up on end. She looks up from our little girl's face, and that's when she saw a shadow standing outside of her door, blocking it from opening, while holding the butt end of a flashlight right up against the window. After her brain had a moment to assemble just what she was looking at, my wife was ready to let out the shriek of all shrieks. But at that same moment, a sheriff pulled up, one who had also seen us go to the car. The officer asked what was going on, when that man tried to say that he was just talking to my wife, who rolled down the window just slightly and said that she was not talking to this man and didn't want to either. That's when the officer asked him his name, and when he turned around to run the man's name in the database, the man tried to scurry away. The name was fake, hence why the other officers within the show got up and left. The man was detained. He gave his real name, and within 1 minute of calling it in, the man was then in cuffs. Turned out, he had multiple felony warrants out for him, all for attempted kidnappings. While right outside of our window, that man was waiting for the nearby cars to clear out. He was in the midst of trying to take my wife and my infant daughter. Had that cop not been right where he was, who knows how it would have unfolded. Too often, in stories like these, people are left wondering, where was the cop when I needed one? Well, this is the odd story, where luckily, the cop that we needed was right there. When I was around 6 years old, my parents divorced, and my dad was soon given full custody. At that point, my mom was an alcoholic and had racked up a few DUIs and such. Anyway, my younger sister and I moved in with our father, and we moved to a new neighborhood. Us kids then transferred to the nearby elementary school. The school was pretty close to our new house, maybe only 5 or 6 blocks away, close enough to walk, but my sister and I were too young to walk alone. Sometimes our dad would walk us to school in the morning and then walk back himself, and less commonly, he'd walk to pick us up in the afternoon, although most of the time, he picked us up in his black Mazda. The way pickups worked at my school was pretty common. We went out with our class, stood by our teacher and classmates, and when a car pulled up, designated staff members would ask who the student was that they were there picking up, before going to find them with their class and escorting the kids to their car. Seeing as my mom was in jail at this time, the only person who ever picked us up was my dad. This one particular day while I was in 3rd grade and my sister was in 1st, we were outside waiting to be picked up. After being outside for only a few minutes, my little sister came running over to me and said someone who wasn't our dad was in a car to pick us up. The man had located my sister first and said both of our names. She said that he'd smiled at her and told her our dad had told him to come pick us up that afternoon. But she said she wanted to find me first before she got into the car, since she didn't recognize him as one of our dad's friends. Thank God she did that. Our dad had always told us not to talk to strangers, so I grabbed my teacher and told her what happened. She got a supremely alarmed look on her face and told us to stay where we were, while she told another teacher, or something to that effect. Our dad arrived to pick us up a few minutes later, and we ultimately got home safely. We told him about what had happened, and we all had a long talk about safety protocol. He asked my sister to describe the man and the car, and that's when he called the police and gave them the best description he could, although my sister was very young and wasn't very focused on important details like that. A few weeks later, it happened again. But this time, the man pulled up and he said my name. Now, my dad had given the school the same info that he'd given to the police, but presumably, whoever this man was, he had multiple vehicles, because my sister said that he'd been in a red car, and this one was black, similar to my father's. I saw the black car and instinctively ran up to it, but luckily, I caught a glimpse of the face sitting behind the steering wheel before I opened the door and hopped right in. He was middle-aged, extremely pale, with a really angular face. We made eye contact, and his mouth was smiling, but the smile didn't quite make it to his eyes. They looked really wrong to me, squinty and almost angry. I quickly turned back to the carpool assistant who delivered me to the car in an effort to alert her. But by the time that I did this, that man was already pulling away from the curb. And just like my little sister, I couldn't give many more details. My dad contacted the police again, but without any license plate information, they weren't able to do much. The last time I saw this man wasn't until months later, near the end of the school year. I was walking home with a big group of kids that lived in my neighborhood, and he drove by us before slowing the car down and attempting to talk to us. I recognized his face immediately and alerted the other kids around me to run. Luckily, we were only about 3 houses down from where one of my friends lived, concerning her parents significantly as we explained the situation. I never saw him again after that. My dad started dating my now stepmom, and we moved to her neighborhood and switched schools shortly thereafter. I still think about this man occasionally though. His face was actually in a dream of mine a few nights back, which gave me the inspiration to share my experience. I'm in my 20s now, full-grown adult, and to this day, I don't know how he knew our names, how he knew anything about us really. It's pretty terrifying to think about what would have happened to my tiny little sister if she'd gotten in that car with that man instead of coming to find me. It's equally as terrifying thinking about what might have happened to me if I had done the same. I don't have kids of my own yet. I don't know if pickup protocol is the same at elementary schools now as it was then. But I encourage all parents out there to have a code word or some system with their child so they know not to just climb into a car with some strange adult claiming to be friends with their parents. This is a story that I'm not supposed to be telling. It's a family secret that I'm not even supposed to know about. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s or early 30s at the time, and despite being young, my grandfather was a born leader. He was a great principal, and everyone loved him. I can attest to that, as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration that he received was true and heartfelt. There was this young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called in the boy's father and had a talk with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy and model student. He would see the dad playing basketball with his son in the schoolyard after he got home from work. It was one of those moments that he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything had such an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with a particular employee, Stanley, the janitor, who had quite the knack for showing up to work drunk. You see, Stanley was an alcoholic, and one with a mean streak. My grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with Stanley's behavior, when finally one day, Stanley showed up to work so drunk that my grandpa sent him home and called the superintendent to let him know that he was going to fire Stanley the next morning. My grandfather then asked the superintendent to let him deal with Stanley when he was sober, because otherwise, Stanley wasn't a stable person. As it goes in these kind of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself and fire him then and there, despite my grandfather's warning. The superintendent acted independently and didn't even think to call my grandpa to tell him about it either. So he was completely in the dark, thinking that he would be left to deal with Stanley in the morning. Upon hearing the news, Stanley was enraged and drove back to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, tore the entire school apart until he finally found what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury on his way out, and that's when he saw the father and his son still playing basketball in the yard. That's when he walked towards them, pulling something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. And even though the father was devastated, hysterically crying out, he somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley before shooting him. My grandfather was called back to school immediately because the police said that there were 2 dead bodies on the grounds. The little boy and Stanley were dead. What my grandfather was met with once he got back to the school was a heavy police presence, 2 white sheets from the coroner draped over the bodies of the deceased, and the gut-wrenching cries from the father, no doubt emanating from the fact that he couldn't save his son. It was clear there and then that that father would never forgive himself for that day. My grandpa was pulled aside by one of the police officers who had searched Stanley for evidence. They had found a list on him, a hit list, made up of the people that he was going to kill, along with all of the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when he searched the offices. My grandpa was number 1 on that list. So, if it weren't for that father, it's likely that I would have never been able to meet my grandfather. And just as likely that my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had been able to complete his mission. Even now, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this after his initial recount, and my mother made me swear to never tell him that I knew about it. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day that he died. My grandfather was an amazing man. He never wished harm on anyone. He only extended his hand to assist others. I know that if he could have had that day over, instead of walking to his car after leaving the building, just witnessing that father and son duo, he would have stopped on the courts and told them both with love to go home for the night. We can't go back to these moments, and we can't change the choices that we make. And it's a stark reminder that one choice, whether made by us or by others, can be the difference between life and death. Edit. I just looked up some records online after finally finding information about this case. Apparently, there was another man who Stanley killed that night. When Stanley had showed back up to school, he took the life of another janitor that evening. And during the commission of this crime, he thought that the boy and his father had seen him. So when Stanley emerged from the school building, he tried to shoot the father. But while trying to wrestle the gun away from Stanley, it went off, striking the young boy. I wanted to make sure that I clarified this, because leaving out these details, including the extra loss of life, feels as if it almost makes the crime worse. I know that Stanley took his last breath that day, but I can't help but feel as if he got off easy for what he had done. I recently learned of some chilling details about a person that was heavily involved in my life as a child. I thought this would be appropriate to share. Throughout my childhood, I was extremely shy and didn't find myself going out of my way to make friends in new settings. I had recently started preschool at my grandmother's church, and I remember being on the playground playing by myself when a woman introduced herself to me. Her name was Candy, and she looked like any other sweet, old woman. She almost reminded me of my own grandmother, with her abundance of white curls on her head. Candy was a volunteer at the church, and typically watched over the children while they played, so we would see each other fairly often. I can't remember much about the start of this friendship, but I presume one thing led to another before I was frequently spending time with her, both in and out of school. My parents were grateful to have someone who was interested in watching me, as I was the youngest of 3 kids, and my parents worked full-time while also taking my brother and sister to and from school, sports, or friends' houses. So having a helping hand was an absolute blessing for them. To be honest, I don't remember too many details about spending time with Candy, but I suppose we spent our time frequenting ice cream shops, parks, and the like. I do have one memory of going to her house, where I'd never been before, and as she was showing me around, I remember passing through the dining room and seeing a little girl who looked to be around 10 to 12 years old. Candy introduced me to her and told me that she lived down the street and would spend a lot of time at her house. I'm not sure why, but I remember being jealous. I guess I was jealous that Candy also cared for and spent time with another child. I'd never felt that way before, and I'm not sure why I remember that so clearly. For some reason, this was the only time I ever went to her house, at least that I can remember. Fast forward a few years. I'm in 1st grade at this point. I had totally forgotten about Candy and hadn't seen her since I graduated preschool 2 years prior. My neighbors, who I carpooled with to school, had dropped me off at my house one afternoon, and that's when I spotted a Target grocery bag hooked to our front door. I wasn't sure what it could be, or why my brother or sister didn't bring it inside when they arrived home from school an hour or so before me. Once I took it inside, I noticed writing on the bag, indicating that there was a gift inside for me from Candy. I ran up the stairs to my room, and to my surprise, there were several adorable brand new outfits inside, just for me. I immediately tried each of them on, and was so excited to show my mom when she got home from work. Once my mom was home, I eagerly showed her the outfits that Candy had left for me. Unfortunately, my mom wasn't as excited as I was. In fact, she was quite angry. She yelled at me to take them off, and that she'd be returning them to Candy immediately. I was so confused as to why she was upset with me. What did I do wrong? These were free clothes, a gift. Wouldn't it be rude to return a gift to someone? To avoid being punished, I put the clothes back in the bag and handed them to my mom. We never spoke of this again, and Candy slipped my mind again for the next several years. Well, a few years back, my sister was home visiting from college. With nothing else to do that day, we decided to go to Target to shop for useless things that we didn't need. As we were walking through the parking lot, the thought of the Target bag from Candy randomly dawned on me. I proceeded to laugh and asked my sister if she remembered, and if she knew why Mom was in such an awful mood that day that forced me to give the clothes back to Candy. My sister stopped dead in her tracks and said, "Wait, do you not remember what Candy did to us?" Taken aback, I shook my head and begged her to tell me what I didn't remember. She refused to talk about it and told me that I'd be better off asking Mom. The rest of our day together was far from normal. It was as if a giant rain cloud followed us wherever we went. I guess the weirdness of that day caused the thought of Candy to slip my mind once again, and I didn't remember to ask my mother about anything that happened until I was in college a few years later. We were saying goodbye to my grandmother after grabbing lunch one day when she mentioned to my mom that someone's funeral was that weekend. They sat in silence for a few minutes just staring at each other. When, after my grandmother left, I asked my mom who it was they were talking about, and that's when she informed me about Candy's death. The realization that I had never heard the true stories about this woman crossed my mind, and I asked my mom about what my sister refused to speak on. My mother proceeded to relay the horrible stories to me about the little old woman that tried to take me away from my family. You see, at the beginning of the friendship, Candy genuinely was a big help to my family, and was someone that they trusted. However, Candy's intentions were questioned by my grandmother, who shared a few of her concerns with my father after hearing some odd stories from her friends at church. She felt as though something was off with Candy, and she didn't like that I spent so much time with her. Coming from a woman who never had a negative thing to say about anyone, my father became slightly wary of Candy, but he assumed that my grandmother was just being overly cautious. After some time of Candy watching over and babysitting me, her demeanor began to change, and she started acting possessive of me and becoming hostile towards my parents. She would show up unannounced to our house asking for me, and if I wasn't there, she would become incredibly angry and yell at my parents about how awful they were. She would continuously tell them that they didn't deserve me, and only she was worthy of taking care of me. This happened several times before my parents told her to stop coming to the house, or they would involve the police. This inclined Candy to start calling the house and leaving messages for me, which my parents obviously wouldn't tell me about. In these voicemails, she would cry to me and try to convince me to leave with her and leave my family. She would talk about how awful my parents were and how she could give me a much better life than they could. The voicemails that were intended for me soon turned to threats directed at my parents. She threatened to call the police or child services to have me removed from the home and placed into her care. She threatened to tell the police about my parents' violence and abuse towards me and my siblings, none of which was true. Once she realized that her phone calls weren't working, she began making efforts to show up at the house again. She started by driving up and down our street, day after day. She would ask our neighbors, and then the neighbors' children, if anyone knew if I was home or where I was. She would park her car several houses down and train her eyes on our home. Eventually, our neighbors began recognizing her car and what was going on. They would then inform my parents when she came around, asking about me. After some time of doing this, she took it upon herself to come to the front door, while only my brother, who was likely 12 years old at the time, and I were at home. She started banging on the door, begging to see me. My brother opened one of the front doors, keeping our metal storm door between them shut, while simultaneously telling her that she needed to leave. Candy proceeded to plead with him to let her in, and he replied that I wasn't home, despite me napping soundly upstairs. Candy partially forced herself through the door when my brother put his hand to her face, shoving her out the door, and telling her that the police had been called. She left after that and distanced herself for a while before she encountered the final straw with my mother. One day, my mom and I were backing out of the driveway to attend a birthday party when Candy pulled in behind our car, blocking us from leaving. She came up to the window, and my mother rolled it down, ready to unload on this woman. Candy ignored her, looked right past my mom, into the back seat where I was sitting. She said to me, "Wouldn't you rather come with me and never see your mom again? I love you so much more than they ever did and can give you everything you want if you just come with me." This pushed my mother over the brink. She never thought that she would upset or fight with an old woman, but the day had finally come when it was absolutely necessary. She screamed and yelled at her, making sure to include that Candy would regret the day that she ever came into contact with me or my family if my mom ever saw her again. Something she said must have actually scared Candy, because she drove off and didn't appear in our lives again until the Target bag incident. I'm not sure how I never knew any of this happened and never thought anything was weird about her when I was a child. But I guess my parents did a good job of shielding me from the horrors of the situation. After hearing about everything that took place, I assumed that there must have been a reason she came to be so obsessed with me. Did she not have her own family? Did she lose children or grandchildren and was looking for some way to fill the void? According to my mom, Candy had several children that were much older than me, as well as young grandchildren. Thus, I'm not sure what would have sparked her interest in me. But thankfully, we no longer have to worry about her. Part of me still wonders if I repressed any memories or conversations with her that were upsetting. Did she ever privately talk to me about how awful my parents were? Or how she wanted to take me away from my family? Did I ever agree to leave with her? I also wonder if, as I grew older and joined social media like Facebook, did she ever search my name? Did she ever watch me when I was in middle school, high school, or when I went away for college? I have so many questions, but I'm glad that we never had to find out if she was going to follow through with any of her threats. As a word of advice, I'd suggest always trusting your grandmother's instincts about other grandmothers, and maybe not being so inclined to befriend the old woman volunteering on the playground. This all happened yesterday, and I'm sharing from inside our motel room because everything is still so fresh in my mind. But here we go. Fort Bragg, California, small beach town northwest of Sacramento. It has a kind of Stephen King feel to it. You know what I mean? That misty, almost eerie small harbor town. But it's beautiful, and it's a huge tourist attraction. You get people from all over the US that travel here. My fiance and I decided to drive up here after I had to take some time off of work due to stress. It was a last-minute decision, and we packed up all of our bags in less than 10 minutes, grabbed our dog, and took off. If we wouldn't have had our dog with us, I'm pretty sure I would have lost her. It's our second day here right now, and we're staying at a motel that overlooks the ocean. We're literally 10 steps from the beach. You can see the fog roll in during the early hours of the morning and watch the fishing boats leave the harbor to go get their haul for the day. It really is a beautiful thing to see. We woke up early, and I was craving, and I mean craving, eggs and bacon. After getting dressed and deciding what spot to stuff our faces at, we left for our morning adventure. See, here's where I made my mistake. I was driving down the road, and it looked like the stop that we were approaching was a four-way stop sign. I figured wrong because when I pulled out, I cut off a small Ford Ranger with a dinky trailer attached to it and two old men driving. I realized just a little too late that I had cut them off. They threw up their hands, pointed at me, and slammed on their horn. But Lily, my fiance, didn't even notice it. I threw my hands up in a, sorry, I'm just a dipshit tourist kind of way, and all they did was stare me down. It was a hillbilly standoff that George Strait would have been proud of. I didn't think much of it once I got out of the situation. I just kept driving down the foggy 2-lane road to get breakfast. I didn't even think to say anything to her about it. I never thought that I'd see those two guys again, and I didn't want her to complain about me not knowing how to drive. I was wrong though. I was wrong, and I'll never forget what happened next. We got back to the motel after a not so great, yet overly expensive breakfast. We strolled onto the beach, took a moment to take in the lapping waves and feel the ocean spray on our faces, before we headed back to our motel room, cuddled up, and talked about our plans for the future and what we wanted to do in life. But midway through our conversation, Lily realized that we were out of dog food to feed Bruce. That's when I agreed to go up to the cute, yet slightly creepy market and grabbing a bag of goodies. I kissed her on the cheek and jumped in the Navi. I got about halfway to the store before I realized that I had forgotten my wallet on the nightstand. So after a quick U-turn, I pulled back into the motel parking lot. And that's where I saw it. That same Ford Ranger with the janky trailer attached to it. The only difference was that the driver and passenger, a much less affable versions of Hank and Boomhauer, weren't inside of it. I thought to myself, I didn't remember seeing that truck here last night. I walked up to our door while looking over my shoulder wondering, what are the chances these douchebags are staying here? And then, not 2 seconds later, my heart began to beat faster. Our motel door was open, barely cracked. It was open slightly to the point where you could see a sliver of light, but nothing more inside. I slowly pushed it open, and to my surprise, I didn't see anything. Lily and Bruce were both gone. It was like they were never really there at all. My heart started racing even more, and I dropped my keys on the floor and ran outside, heart beating faster than a jackhammer in New York. I didn't see Lily or Bruce outside, nor did I see the creepy old guys from the Ford truck. I was becoming both angry and frantic at this point. All I'm thinking is, where are you guys? Before the screaming inside my head was cut off by the sound of very familiar barking. I heard Bruce, and that's when I ran. I ran faster than I've ever done in my entire 28 years of life. I ran straight over to the front office where the sound was coming from. And that's when I saw her and our dog inside the office. Lily was bawling, sitting on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. And Bruce's hair was standing straight up until he saw that it was me sprinting towards them. Lily got up, ran to my arms. Meanwhile, the clerk is on the phone, and I'm left wondering, what the f*** happened in the 2 minutes that I was gone? This is what happened, told by Lily, and it makes my blood run cold. It turns out, as soon as I left, not even 30 seconds went by, and that's when those inbred assholes knocked on our door. Lily instinctively opened it up, thinking that it was me forgetting my wallet, which I did. And that's when they tried to force their way into the room, saying, "You can thank your boy toy for what's coming to you," all while grabbing her, pushing her, and attempting to cover her mouth. But those assholes didn't realize one thing, and that's that we had a dog in our back seat when I cut them off. Bruce jumped off the bed and didn't hesitate to bite the one grabbing her. They tried their best to kick him, tried to shake him off, but Bruce wasn't letting go. After being bit and realizing that the noise would draw attention if they didn't leave, they ran off, and Lily was able to sprint to the front office and wait for help, while Bruce followed suit. I wasn't there. I couldn't protect her. If we would have found a dog sitter, and our plans weren't so last minute, she could be gone right now. But my dog was there, and he did exactly what a good boy, no, the best boy, would do. And for that, he's truly my best friend. If he wasn't there, what would have happened? Would she have been kidnapped, beaten, killed? Maybe all of the above. The craziest thing is that they haven't been caught yet. We filed all the reports with the local sheriff. I told them what had happened earlier that morning, and the cop looked right at me and said, "You're lucky your dog was there, son. If he wasn't, and they got in there with her, you could have been filing a different report right now." At that statement, I felt tears well up in my eyes. I looked over at Lily and at Bruce and thanked God that I rescued him from the pound, because in return, he rescued the love of my life when I couldn't. This story happened when I was about 5 years old, back in 2006. My family and I would travel down to the Jersey Shore every summer. We'd never had any problems until this one specific trip. I did ask my mom to help me share this story, just to make sure that I had all the details correct. When I was a child, I was painfully shy, did my best to keep to myself, and to this day, I still have a hard time confronting people or telling people off without choking up. So I was in complete and utter silence when a girl around the age of 7 came up to me and asked me to play with her. I accepted and walked off with the girl to where her toys and stuff were. Looking back, I don't remember telling my parents that I was leaving. The part of the beach where she was staying was pretty far from where I was staying, and there were very few other people around. It was at the very edge of the beach, before a set of dunes cut off where it would be comfortable to hang out. Now that I look back on it, it was actually very sketchy. This little girl's mom was with her sand toys, but they had nothing else with them. No towels, no umbrella, no chairs, no nothing. Just sand, toys, and the two of them. But of course, me being the stupid 5-year-old that I was, I didn't find this weird at all. Me and the girl swam for I don't even know how long before her mom called us back to the shore. We went over to this lady, and that's when the mom told her daughter that she had forgotten to grab the chairs out of the car and that they needed to head back to the parking lot to get them. The little girl agreed and asked if I wanted to go to the car to help them get the chairs. Again, being shy, especially around adults, I initially hesitated, even said no. That's when the mom began to put her hand on my shoulder and started leading me towards the parking lot. With her hand still nudging me, I remember her saying, "Oh honey, it's okay. We need all the help we can get. We have a lot of stuff to bring back." My little self almost starting to panic at this point. No, I think I should get back to my mom. I don't know why, and I don't remember how, but somehow I calmed down and began walking with them willingly. But that's when my mom starts to dart down the beach, screaming my name. I can still hear it ringing around in my head now. "Get your hands off of my daughter." My mom was still fairly far away, but not far enough off where you wouldn't be able to hear her. This little girl's mom dead-ass ignores my mom, begins to grab my arm tightly, and walks faster. The next thing that this little girl's mom does terrifies me even now, although it didn't back then. She looks down at me while still practically pulling me to the parking lot and says, "Don't listen to her. Just keep walking." Now, I was a dumb little kid, but I wasn't that dumb. I began to cry and scream, saying that I didn't want to help anymore. I just wanted to play with the little girl. Little girl agreed, and she began to look frightened at this point too. My mom caught up to us, ripped me out of this woman's grasp, and ran off with me. My mom was crying and called my dad to tell him that she had found me. I remember looking back over my shoulder at the little girl and her mother and seeing the mom staring absolute daggers through me. Not moving, just staring. Little girl was doing the same, but she did it with fear in her eyes. And that's a stark contrast from the anger that emanated from her mom. In no way do I blame the little girl in this situation. I believe that her mom was trying to take me, for reasons that only God knows why. I think that she had told her daughter to make a friend and bring them back to her. For some reason, I remember being mad at my mom because all I wanted to do was play with this little girl. I never really shared this story before, but I thought that I'd share it because while I've read several stories of people almost getting kidnapped in this sub, most of the assailants were creepy men, not so many middle-aged mothers. So I just want to let everyone know that anyone can be dangerous. And whether you're a kid, an adult, whatever, don't just walk off with anyone you don't know or don't feel comfortable with. By the way, as I was gathering details for this, my mom told me that she was looking for me for about 45 minutes, which means it probably took around 15 minutes to get to that little girl and her mom. Me and little girl played for around 20 minutes, and then 10 minutes of her mother trying to convince me to walk to the parking lot with them. I'm only guessing here. Trying to recall details from when you're 5? Not so easy. I don't know what the plan was for sure, but I know that both on the surface and deep down, I avoided something that could have been life-changing. This happened to me a couple of months ago now, but when it first happened, given how crazy it was, It took me more than a few weeks to collect myself, just enough to share it with others. It's relevant for me to tell you up front that I'm a military veteran, and I have PTSD and anxiety as well as a pretty bad case of depression. I've read that various forms of cognitive behavioral therapy can massively improve PTSD symptoms, and in turn help to reduce my anxiety. So I've been trying a bunch of techniques at home. The problem there is, my wife and I live in a small 2-bedroom ground floor flat with an upstairs neighbor that has absolutely no care for other people in this world. The typical jock douchebag type who's a personal trainer, but he trains at home too, because gains. The kind of guy whose only 2 topics of conversation are protein powder and steamed rice. I'm sure you can imagine the type. Anyway, with that being a constant issue, meditation and quiet mindfulness are just not possible with the constant noise. My solution to this was to do my normal routine during the day, but take advantage of my insomnia later on. At around 11 p.m., maybe midnight, I would don my coat and shoes, and as we lived near the beach, I figured I could walk there, walk on sand, and be mindful to the sounds of the ocean. Sounds nice, doesn't it? It was the first 2 times. But you know what they say. The 3rd time, that's the charm. The walk to the beach from my house isn't that far, maybe a little over half a mile. But once I got there, I would walk to the very end of the beach until you reach the cliffs where there's a World War II artillery gun turret, which was another half mile-ish. Sometimes I would walk the path up the cliff to the gun and stare out into the blackness of the midnight ocean, which was only broken by the occasional flash of light coming from the lighthouse. I would sit and listen to the waves crashing against the cliffs. Sometimes I would close my eyes and just concentrate on nothing, except for that sound. I felt safe there, knowing I was alone, just me and the expansive ocean. Usually before I turned tail and head home, I would walk down to a small row of benches. They're all marked with plaques in remembrance of someone who also came and enjoyed the view, although I imagine that they came during the day. The benches are close to an old pub that had been shut down years ago, and I'd heard the place used to get used as a dogging site, or a brothel, or something like that back in the day. So when I saw a vehicle headlights coming towards the pub, I figured it was some young lads trying to catch potential doggers at it. I sat on the bench and waited for the car to pass, but as it rounded the bend, I was momentarily lit up by the headlamps. The headlights of the vehicle went off immediately, and the car went off-road and out of sight for a moment. At this point, I was fully alert and a bit cautious, so I dropped to one knee and ducked behind the bench that I had been sitting on. The vehicle drove past me. It was only maybe 40 feet from me, and as a lighthouse illuminated the car, I could now see that it was an old beat-up Land Rover kind of vehicle, even equipped with camo on the wings. At that moment, someone popped out of the top of the vehicle with a scoped rifle and a big flashlight. In that instant, in my head, I was back in Iraq, and my senses felt razor sharp. I dropped flat onto my stomach, crawled into a patch of long grass adjacent to the benches. Then I got in a position where I could see them, but they wouldn't be able to see me. The guy with the rifle shone his torch at the exact bench that I had been sitting on. Then the others, no doubt in search for me. He started looking all around him through the scope, looking for where I might have gone. My heart was pounding so hard that I felt as if they could hear it. I held my sleeve over my mouth to muffle the sound of my breathing, but more importantly, to try and hide the condensation of my breath. The vehicle started to move to get a better view of the benches, so I started slowly crawling towards the main road, as not only is there a row of houses, but an old stone bus stop I could take hard cover in if they saw me and opened fire. After about 5 minutes of hiding in the long grass, it began to rain, and they were still clearly looking for me. but were now about 150 feet away. The guy with the rifle was scanning around with his eye down the scope, so I waited till he was looking away from me to seize my moment and run for cover. I pushed my hands hard into the wet dirt to launch myself onto my feet. Then I sprinted towards the bus stop while throwing some zigs and zags in there, just in case they had seen me. Luckily, they hadn't, and I was now far enough away that I could take out my phone and call the police. They were there with a riot van and a squad car in about 10 minutes. And as I was talking with the officers in the van, they spotted the gunner's vehicle and took off after them. The officers in the squad car stayed behind to talk to me. The rain was coming down in sheets by now. They asked me if I was absolutely sure it was a rifle, and I told them yes, it 100% was. The officers both looked at each other, and then one of them asked, "And what exactly is your experience with firearms?" I told them I was ex-Army and had seen my fair share of all kinds of firearms. They then asked me what I was doing there after midnight, which is a pretty fair question to be honest. I explained that quite ironically, I was taking a mindfulness walk to ease my PTSD symptoms. They were satisfied with that explanation, if not somewhat amused, and told me that the armed response unit was en route. I asked if they needed me to stay behind and make a statement, but the officers told me to not bother waiting around, because they most likely wouldn't need to take a statement beyond the call that I made. And also, with the rain torrent coming down, I should get home and get dry. It was over, but I still felt super weird, and my heart was still thumping a mile a minute in my chest. I started the walk home, and when I was about halfway there, a police helicopter buzzed overhead and settled over the area where I'd been sitting on the benches. Full-on spotlight going. It was right then that it hit me like a shotgun to the chest. That happened. That was fucking real. My head started swimming. My heart was pounding twice as hard now, and my legs felt like jelly. My lungs felt glitchy, like I couldn't breathe properly. I dropped to my knees, practically crying in the street in the pouring rain, the only light coming from a nearby street lamp with a flickering bulb. As I was gasping for breath, thoughts flashing in my head, thinking that if I had stayed still, if I hadn't hunched behind the bench, if I hadn't done any number of things differently, then I could have gurgled my last breath alone in the dark, cold, wet dirt. My wife would have been none the wiser till the following day. I have no idea if they were there for me, and if they were, how could they know that I'd be there? I'd been twice before, I suppose, and it's not like there are animals to hunt there beyond foxes. But why hunt for foxes from a vehicle with a rifle and a torch at midnight? I'm not ashamed to say that this experience terrified me. I guess my army training helped me to stay alert and to stay hidden, but I don't really know. I don't go walking at night anymore, and I have the occasional nightmare about this whole thing. I'm sure you understand. After surviving what I survived in the service of my country, I don't want to go face to face with those things while I'm on home soil. Update. Today, I made a call to the local police to try and get an update on what happened. After a quick description of what the initial incident was, the officer on the phone was able to find the incident report right away. Basically, the first officers on the scene confirmed that they had seen a vehicle and that they had gone off-road in pursuit. They said they had given chase over difficult terrain for as long as they were able to. Then the vehicle turned off all lights and made an escape using the dark as cover. The armed response units were called as a precaution and patrolled the entire area while the helicopter was dispatched in order to try and locate the vehicle with heat cameras. Both teams were unsuccessful in finding them, as by the time they had arrived on scene, the perpetrators had gotten away. CCTV was also checked, but yielded absolutely nothing. I told the officer over the phone that I was sorry if they felt that I had wasted their time, and that perhaps I had overreacted on account of my PTSD. She told me that as far as they're concerned, I did the right thing. She also said that there had been a few isolated accounts of gunshots having been heard in that area over the last few weeks. So maybe rethink taking my walk so late at night. I didn't have the energy to explain why I would wait until so late to go walking, but any advice about avoiding getting shot is good advice in my book. So instead, I just agreed with her before ending the call. After I'd hung up, I just sat for a few minutes going over the whole thing in my head. I guess there's a possibility that it was nothing when all is said and done. But if nothing else, this taught me that being hypervigilant isn't always such a bad thing. This happened last night, and after making all the necessary calls and correspondence, I'm still left wondering what it was all about. So I, a 26-year-old female, was up late and working on a project for my job. I'm the type of person that obsesses a lot over the task that I oversee, and was deep into my assignment when I start to feel that rumble in my tummy. I look up and see that it's now 11:30 p.m., and I haven't eaten anything since lunch. I know that I'm not going to pull myself away from my work. There's no way I can at this point. So I pull up the DoorDash app on my phone, and in a few clicks, I submit an order for Thai food from a spot that's open late and is no more than 5 miles from my front door. Perfect. After another couple of minutes, I get the alert saying that Christina P. is picking up my food and should be arriving within 8 to 10 minutes. Wonderful. The pad thai and satay are absolutely calling my name by now, and I'm pumped. Another few minutes pass, and my phone buzzes to let me know that my food has arrived, and almost on cue, I hear a car door open, and the gate to my residence follow it. I creep to my front door, as a lot of us weirdos do, peer through the peephole, and see the driver approach my front door and place the bag in front of my doormat. They raise their phone to their face to take the proof picture, and that's when I notice that the dasher does not appear to be a Christina. This is a dude, tall and broad, but a little rough looking. 5 o'clock shadow, ill-fitting shirt and coat, and a gaze that doesn't seem as if they should have been driving anywhere at all. My phone buzzes again to signify that the food has been dropped. I wait a second for this man to retreat from my front door, but he doesn't. He stands completely still now, hands in his pockets, almost like he's waiting for me to open the door. That's when I say out loud, "Thanks, you can go now," when I hear him mumble something about getting my food while it's still hot. I say, "I'll grab it once you're off my porch. Thanks." Now, I'm not sure if this guy knew that I was talking from right on the other side of my door, peering through the peephole at him, because he doesn't leave the porch. He simply scoots his body to the side, now not directly in line with my door, almost like he's trying to hide himself. I don't say a thing now. We're just locked in some sort of weird game of delivery driver client chicken. When finally, after a minute or two of silence, he straight up approaches my door. It's locked, but he definitely tries to rattle the door handle. This jolts me, and I think that I need to grab my phone now. It's still on the couch, so I go and snag it up before returning to the door. When I look out the peephole again, he's gone. But I'm not sure what that means exactly, because the car that he pulled up in still has its door open, and it's clearly unoccupied. As I'm quietly assessing what to do next, I hear a jostling coming from the side of my living room. It's coming from outside, but sounds like it's right up against the main window on the side of my house. I walk over, and I'm horrified when I see this guy now standing alongside my home, attempting to lift my window. While I was calm and cool before, I'm losing my shit now. I let out a scream, one that you would think would send someone running, but all this man did was look up at me through the exposed glass and smile this lopsided smile right back at me. I make the dash upstairs and immediately call the police, letting them know that I have someone trying to break into my house. While I'm on the phone with dispatch, I look out my window and see that the car is still parked out on the street. Only now, the guy's sitting in the driver's seat and looking up at my house. He sits there for another 5 minutes or so, giving me plenty of time to study the car in the dark, giving the dispatcher all the info that I can about it, before he pulls off into the night. It took the cops about 30 minutes to get to my house. During that time, I'm wondering why it was taking so long. What if the guy had made it in? Did they expect me to fight him off or hide for a full episode of Friends or something? But when they finally did arrive, they let me know what the delay was. Going off the description of the vehicle, they had found a car matching it about 3 blocks from my house while they were en route. The car appeared to have hit a curb, had airbags deployed, no driver at the scene, and several cell phones scattered within the car. After searching the area to no avail, they called it in and continued to me. As I was explaining what happened on my end, the cops get a radio call saying that the car they had found had been reported stolen earlier in the night. They surmised that the phones within the car were likely stolen as well. What scares me even now is what they said next. It was likely that whoever had stolen the car and the phones got a notification that someone wanted food to be delivered. That would be me. They opened up the DoorDash app and accepted the order from a stolen phone that belonged to someone named Christina. Seeing that it was only enough food for one person, they likely figured that I was alone and might make for an easy target for whatever they had planned. Whether it was my willingness to look through the peephole and the resulting hesitance to open the door, or simply their own ineptitude in the situation, I proved to be a more difficult target than they had originally thought. And that is no doubt what kept me safe. By the time this whole situation had cooled off, I wasn't even hungry anymore. I pretty much stayed awake solely on adrenaline. And I haven't gotten any word on if they found the guy yet. But the silver lining here is that I knocked out the rest of that work assignment in the time that I didn't spend sleeping or eating last night. While this situation is terrifying, it likely won't scare me off from using DoorDash in the future. But the steps that I took last night will likely be commonplace for any order that I make moving forward. I moved into my current neighborhood about 4 years ago. It's a decent area with plenty of residences, a few local shops that bring a dose of fun and culture to my walks to and from work. And my apartment building itself is filled with a bunch of wonderful neighbors that I've never had any issue with whatsoever. I understand that my experience may be unique in that regard, so I'm even more grateful for that. To give you an idea, my apartment building is laid out as such: access from the street through a secure main entrance, a lobby that houses mailboxes for all residents, a short side hallway that dumps people at the 2 elevators that serve the entire building, and a hallway the opposite direction that houses the 4 downstairs units of the complex. I occupy the first unit on the left of the first floor. I believe that at one time, this may have been where the landlord lived. However, I'm simply left to guess that because there's no landlord on site now. Just a property manager that stops by every so often to make sure that the elevators are working and the outdoor plants are watered. So here's actually where the story begins. A few weeks back, I was sitting in my living room scrolling away while Hulu played in the background. It was late afternoon, but far from dark. So I was figuring out what sounded good for dinner or what to do later, when I get a buzz on my apartment's intercom. I walk over to the door, press the button, and ask, "Who is it?" When a voice on the other side says, "Hi, this is XYZ Flowers, and I've got a delivery for you. Now, I'll be the first to acknowledge, I don't often get flowers. Certainly I don't order them for myself. But I'd actually just been promoted at work and thought that maybe my folks or girlfriend or someone that I knew sent me something nice. So I hit the button to buzz them in and waited for the knock at my door to come. When it does, I swing the door open to a gentleman carrying a rather abundant flower arrangement. I mean, the thing had to cost a couple $100 at least. Tall, more than a dozen flowers poking out of this vase that itself was almost 2 feet tall, and accompanied by a lavender-colored bow wrapped around it. I'm in the midst of my own observant stupor when the delivery man says, "Sherry?" It catches me off guard and snaps me back to reality when he repeats it again, only this time adding a little more detail. Does Sherry live here? So, I'm a guy. I live alone, and I've never heard the name that he's saying before. So eventually, I get out, "No, nobody by that name lives here. I'm sorry, man, you must have the wrong address." He takes a moment, looks at the electronic device in his offhand, before saying, "Nope, this is the right address. Says right here. Are you sure that Sherry doesn't live here?" I think I know who lives in my house, so politely I say again, "I don't think you've got the right place." I tell him that there's a resident directory by the front door if he wants to take a look. Maybe that's one of my neighbors that I'm unaware of. I don't know. But obviously, these aren't meant for me. He looks around my doorframe and says that this is the address and apartment that he was told to go to. And the look on his face conveys a message of, "Seriously, man, just take the flowers so I can go." Well, okay. At this point, I'm more wrapped up in the mystery of who sent these and who they were to than the actual delivery guy himself. So I take them out of his hand as he simply turns and walks off. As I come back into my apartment, staring at this gigantic arrangement, I notice that there's a card tucked between a few of the stems. Now my intrigue is beyond piqued. I place the flowers down on the table and pull out the tiny card, pop that bad boy open, and read the words, "I've been thinking about you, Sherry." Signed, XO. Okay, I'm starting to piece things together. These flowers are probably from an admirer of this woman, Sherry, and for whatever reason, the sender just had the wrong address, which is a shame because the arrangement is beautiful. I feel bad for the poor dude that mistakenly sent me flowers. After checking the directory out, I see that there's no Sherry listed. I feel like I've done all I can do. So on my table, the flowers stay. Well, the next day, I'm leaving the building when I come across the property manager guy in front of the complex watering the plants. I think to myself that maybe he knows if there's someone in the apartments named Sherry. If so, I still want to get her the flowers. So I walk up to him and say, "I got this flower delivery yesterday, and I think they're meant for someone else. Is there someone in the building named Sherry maybe?" This guy, an older gent that I think has been in charge of the building for more than a few years now, stops watering and turns to face me. He asks if I was sure that they said Sherry. I told him I was, because the driver said it a few times while right in front of me. That's when the color visibly drains from his face, before he shakes his head and tells me something that I just wasn't at all expecting. He tells me that the previous occupant of my unit, the lady that had lived there more than 5 years ago, was named Sherry. A sweet woman in her 40s that more or less kept to herself. No kids, no family. While she was quiet and respectful, her boyfriend was far from the same. He was loud, brash, and seemed like he had a bit of a mean streak, at least according to other neighbors. Eventually, Sherry had had enough and managed to kick the guy out. Things got quiet, went back to peaceful for a while. But one night, when Sherry was returning home from work, she was walking up to the complex door when neighbors heard a single shot ring out. By the time that someone had ventured out, they found Sherry lying in a pool of her own blood, with her keys still in her hand. The police and an ambulance were called, but she was already gone. The cops had the boyfriend in mind from the get, but days, weeks, and months went by, and they were unable to locate him. With no family of her own to keep the torch lit, the case went cold and may have been pushed aside by others. After sitting vacant for a few months, I found a cute little apartment on the ground floor of a secure building and moved on in, completely unaware of what had happened to its previous inhabitant, less than 50 feet from my front door. The manager said that it could have been a mean joke by some prankster or someone looking to drum up drama. I don't know, and I suppose it could have been, but such an elaborate display probably didn't come from some rando. I can't know for certain if it came from the person we're all thinking they came from, but that's definitely what my gut is telling me. And that alone sends some major shivers down my spine. I let those flowers sit on my dining room table for maybe 2 days, but every time I walked by them, the images and thoughts that they conjured up proved too much for me to handle. I don't know what they were meant to represent, but I chucked those things, vase and all, out into the dumpster without a second thought. Nothing else weird has happened since the flower delivery. I have no reason to think that anything will happen, but knowing what I know now, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't feel an odd sort of feeling every time I walk in or out of the main doorway. I'm going to start this off by saying that I live right outside a fairly large city here in the Midwest United States. While I know that crime is prevalent in my city, I've never felt like I was close to being a victim of any sort. Whether that comes from having my head on a swivel, knowing what to look out for, or simply not inviting trouble my direction, I don't know. But I'm glad to be in the position that I'm in. Plus, as a guy in his mid-30s that has a little heft to him, I don't think I look like the most appealing target. This helps me in my profession as an overnight security guard, no doubt, as I come into contact with a lot of people, though nobody has ever tried me before. Well, as anyone who works nights can tell you, my circadian rhythm is all kinds of messed up. When I get off work, I tend to only sleep for a few hours at a time before my body says it's time to get up and do stuff as the sun rises. That being said, I try to combat this by taking naps wherever possible. This story happened one afternoon just as I was waking up from a nap and starting to get ready for work. I was still shaking off the cobwebs when, as I walked from my bedroom to my bathroom, I thought I might have made it up at first, but as I'm finishing my leak, I hear a knock coming from my front door. It wasn't a pounding or a banging, but actually a sort of light tap. That's probably what contributed to my feeling that I had imagined it at first. I pull out my phone as I stand in my hallway and tap on my doorbell app. The video feed appears, and I see a young man in front of my house, and he's holding a box. It's actually a pizza box. I'm quite familiar with those, so that was easy to identify. But what I couldn't identify was why this kid was at my door with one. I obviously didn't order any pizza while sleeping, so I was a bit confused to begin with. I use the app to speak to him and say, "Hey, can I help you?" I'm thinking that hearing the voice coming from my doorbell may have caught him off guard, because it took him a second of looking around to realize there was no one at the door or out there with him, before he stammers out, "Oh yeah, I've got your pizza here. Will you come sign your receipt?" I tell him point blank that I didn't order a pizza, and that it may have been one of the adjoining houses that did. He says, "No, it's supposed to come here. Maybe your wife ordered it?" Now, I'm not married, so I know that's not the case. I tell him that that's not possible, and that he's got the wrong spot. That's when he says, visibly frustrated now, "It's already paid for. Will you just come and get your pizza so I can go?" Now, I don't exactly appreciate the attitude, and I'm not going to do anything to make things easier on this guy now. But as I'm silently looking at the feed on my phone, something pops out that I hadn't noticed up until that point. The kid isn't wearing anything that would identify him as a delivery driver. There's no shirt or hat with his employer on it. I can't see a car with the company sign on it. Nothing. So now, I have all the little bells going off. I ask him if he can read the name of who made the order, when instead of saying a name, or even saying that he's not allowed to, he says, "It's on the receipt. You can see it when you open the door," before taking his non-pizza holding hand and slamming it against the door 3 times. He then looks over his shoulder, almost as if to make sure that no one has seen or heard him fly off the handle. At this point, this whole thing is smelling fishy, so I say one final time, "I didn't order any pizza. I need you to leave my property now." And this sends him into a rage. He drops the pizza, turns around, and begins donkey kicking my door. I've had just about enough. I walk back into my bedroom, head to my closet, and grab my home defense shotgun from my lockbox. As I'm walking back towards my front door, I can hear the kicks getting louder and louder as I approach. I'm now about 3 feet from my entryway when, in between kicks, I take that opportunity to rack around in the chamber. For those of you that have firearms, you know that that can be a loud and sobering noise to hear. Apparently, that young man felt the same way. The kicks immediately stop, and I don't hear anything further. I stand in my living room for a few minutes, just to hear if that was actually the end of it all. When I don't hear any more movement, I look out my peephole to see nothing but air outside. I open the door, and my eyes are drawn to the pizza box on my doorstep. But that's all it was. A box. No saucy bread and toppings inside. It's at this point that I take a step back inside and bring my phone back to my face. I play back my doorbell footage right at the moment that I rack a shell. I can hear it play back in the audio, and I can see it on the guy's face that he knew exactly what that sound was as he takes off running. What I wasn't expecting, though, was to see 3 other people take off running with him. They had been hidden behind my courtyard wall that my doorbell wouldn't have been able to see, but they all bolted in the same direction, no doubt telling me that they were all together. That's when it clicks. This was a potential home invasion. Given all the earmarks, it seems like it was a setup to get someone, I don't even know if it was me specifically, to open their door unwittingly, before storming them, outnumbering them, and gaining full access to everything inside the house. It was something that I'd heard about, seen on TV, but had never expected to land at my front door. That being said, I'm glad to know that even off only a few hours of sleep, even flying mainly on autopilot, I had the sense to not be lured out, not get caught in the trap of free pizza, and ultimately, not land myself in any real danger. I encourage everyone out there that before you open that door, to always be sure you know who and what awaits you outside. One momentary slip of judgment could be all it takes to let the bad guys win. Listening to some of the stories featured here reminded me of something that happened during my holiday this past Christmas. I went on a family vacation with my dad, mom, and brother to Tasmania, which is this big island to the south of Australia. I wasn't terribly interested in the trip, just wanted to spend time with my family, so I left all the bookings to my dad. And after this, I never will again. He has his own Airbnb that he manages, so I thought he would be able to find decent places on his own. But I guess that's my fault for assuming the best. When we rocked up to the Airbnb that my dad had booked, the first thought I had was, if I wanted to sell drugs, I would probably do it here. My mom wasn't impressed at all and was already telling my dad off for booking it. I didn't say anything though. Maybe the inside would be nicer. But it was a dingy little house. The paint was peeling. The roof was rusty. And there were plants overgrown to the side of the building. Almost as if they were grown into the actual foundation and the wooden planks of the house. There were 3 entrances. The first one I worked out was the entrance for the host. It looked okay. Not as bad as our entrance. A little tidier even. It went downstairs, so we figured out after a while that the host most likely lived below us. The second entryway looked like it was the main entrance to the house, but it was sealed shut. The door looked like it would break down if anyone was to even push on it slightly, and it was obviously unused. The third door was ours, and aside from the overgrown plants lining it, it was fairly normal. From the looks of it, we figured out later that it looks like the host had divided the house up somehow. She lived below. We rocked upstairs. But there was one half of the house upstairs that just wasn't accounted for. It's hard to explain, but the space we occupied only made up half the house, and it only went up to the main entrance that I spoke of, which was exactly in the middle of the house. We checked in, which consisted of grabbing the keys from the outside lockbox. The host had never contacted us up to this point. All was well on the inside. It looked a little bit old, but it wasn't creepy from the get-go. Now, I did notice some odd things, and I only mentioned this to my dad. There were a bunch of antique instruments displayed at the entrance, and right on the top of one of the pianos were 3 things that looked like urns. Now, to explain, I'm of Chinese descent, and these urns freaked me the fuck out. Some people think they're for displaying, but we use them to store dead people's ashes, as is customary in several other places in the world. So I really didn't like them being there. I told my dad, and he didn't exactly like it either, but he went and tapped on the urn, which, by the way, what the fuck? To see if there was something in it. And from his tap, he couldn't quite tell. But he did mention that the one that he tapped was definitely one used for ashes. It had scripts on it for like safe passage to the afterworld, at least from what he could make out. After I stopped freaking out, I went and called dibs on the biggest room, but then noticed that there were heaps of mirrors all around this room. Again, another thing, not sure if it's Chinese necessarily, but we don't like sleeping with mirrors facing us when we were in bed, at least if we can help it. So I went to move one of them, which was smack bang in front of the bed. It was leaned up against a door, and when I took the mirror away, the door actually opened a little bit. The placement of the mirror and the door being ajar freaked me out a little bit more, so I got my dad, and we decided that it was better that I slept with Mom in another room, and he would take this room with my brother. Again, my dad being dad, he opened the door a little bit and shouted, "Hello," before I told him to shut up. I had a peek inside, but I couldn't make out much, only that it was dusty and seemed to be a part of the other half of the house. Soon after this, my dad placed a chair and a suitcase in front of the door to help keep it shut. Now, fast forward to that night, everyone was sleepy and headed for bed. I stayed up a little late because I had some emails from work to catch up on, and I went to work in the living room area. At one point in the evening, likely no later than 11:30, I felt like I heard a few thumps coming from above me. But I didn't know how that could be, because the only thing above me was the roof. It sounded like footsteps, and then they were followed by the loudest and most horrendous noise. It sounded almost as if a train was on top of me, screeching like steel on steel, and it lasted for about 10 seconds. I literally froze at that point. I didn't know what to do. I thought my dad would come check on me, but no one ever did. Once the sound stopped, I didn't go and seek anybody out because if I was the only one that heard it, I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't say anything the next morning because I thought that maybe there was a chance that I imagined it out of sheer tiredness. But the following night, the same thing, except I was in bed this time, not quite asleep. It was around the same time that the same exact noise started up once more. My mom woke up, but was just as frozen as me. Dad eventually came to check on us, and we were all just frozen there listening to this noise, wondering what the hell it was. After it stopped, we were all freaked but managed to shrug it off and catch some sleep. But before I nodded off, I remember hearing some faint thumps, just like the ones from the night before. The next morning, we had kind of a family meeting of sorts to discuss all of this. That's when I told them about the first night. We were extremely unsettled at this point, and extremely glad that it was checkout day. We just got the hell out of there. To my knowledge, we never found out what that was. The creepiest thing, though, was that after we packed up and were well away from this place, Dad was driving, but he still looked really disturbed. So I asked him if he was all right. He said, "I am now, but I didn't sleep so well last night." I pressed him on this and asked him, was it the noise? He said no, that didn't bother him much compared to the other thing that he experienced. What bothered him was when we left the property on the second day, he still had his suitcase on top of the chair blocking the door in his room. He had just showered, so he also left a towel on the chair to dry. He said when we returned, he noticed the door was slightly ajar again. The chair had moved slightly, and the towel was now on the floor, as if someone had tried to push it from the other side, but was unsuccessful after they noticed all the stuff on the other end. I forced him to ask the host about the noise and the door. She replied that the door was the door to her art room, and that any noise that we heard coming from the roof was likely just a possum. No need to be worried about it. I don't believe her. That noise wasn't something an animal would make. And even racking my brain now, I don't know what it would have taken for a human to make that noise either. Suffice it to say, we won't be heading back to that Airbnb. And host, just know that if you got a negative review, that was from us. I'm going to keep some of these details vague because I seriously don't want the host to find out that I shared this story. I don't think they would approve. And while withholding some of that stuff, I'll still try my best to make this as comprehensive as possible. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semesters, there's a big break. And between myself and my buddy that I spent most of the time with during the exchange, we decided we'd go on a longer backpacking trip through Mexico together. We had a rough plan on where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure from where we would take it from. We wanted to keep things flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before our trip ended, we finally decided we would take our flight from a city that was close and had some really cheap flights. But the city itself didn't really have anything to offer. But on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport, in a house with a pool, and we thought we'd treat ourselves to a relaxed pool day at the end of our trip. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican, the wife was from Europe, and was even fluent in our native language. So we arranged that we would take a bus to the airport and that they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived in the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport, since it wasn't directly in his route, so he basically dropped us off on the highway. That was already a pretty shitty situation to begin with, standing with our backpacks at the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, in a not-so-safe region of Mexico. But I called the hosts, sent them our GPS location, and they said, no problem. They'd come and get us. So the husband came to pick us up, although it was a rather uncomfortable situation to be getting into a car with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo, without a mustache, and as I did my best to make small talk with him, he only gave single-syllable answers or straight out ignored me. Well, he's just not a big talker, I thought, and I hoped that we would arrive soon. Looking back now, I can see a million red flags, but for some reason, at that time, we just didn't see them. Either we were too tired or, to be honest, we didn't really have any other choice than simply going along. So anyway, we arrive, and that should have immediately set alarms off. Once again, we were even deeper in the middle of fucking nowhere. Nothing but fields of sheep and goats around, when all of a sudden, a gravel road branches off from the paved road. And along the gravel, there are about 6 huge mansions, all with 2-meter walls surrounding them, topped with NATO fence, huge gates, and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we made it to where we were staying, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman that was very talkative and overall very pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table, not saying a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late on us, and we were tired from our long day. The next morning, we saw that the weather was not so good, so we decided to head into town and see a few touristy things that it had to offer, instead of spending it at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark, but at that point, we decided to jump into the pool anyway. We were here. The wife joined us, and at some point, my friend made the mistake to ask how they were able to afford such a beautiful house. It really didn't match the price range of jobs that they were telling us they were doing. She deflected a bit and added that her husband was very handy because he had grown up in the streets. He had basically built the house himself. We realized then that it maybe wasn't the best topic, so we broke the conversation off. This was to be the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early the next morning. We still had a little mota left that we had bought on the trip, and we thought that it might be nice to smoke a little bit, since it was our last night. But this was a family home, and they had kids around. We thought it might be better for us to speak to our hosts, to see if they would mind. So later on in the evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked out on the terrace, which for some reason she found quite amusing and began to laugh. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "Mi amor, the boys asked if it would be okay if they smoked some weed. What do you think?" He just laughed, but didn't give an answer. We looked at her with a dumbfounded expression, and she told us, "Sure, just go ahead." So we went out to the terrace and began smoking our joint. Later, the husband and wife joined us, and we had a nice little chat. This is where things got really fucked up. For some reason, they started asking all sorts of questions about the weed. Where we got it, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay for that back in Europe. They just seemed all too interested in the weed. And at one point, the wife nonchalantly revealed to us, "Yeah, we thought about doing that as a source of income. You know, selling weed. But too many people die doing that because the cartels don't like it." Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that. This admission immediately sobered me up. Did she just say that her husband used to murder people? And as if he read my mind, Her husband added, "Yeah, when I was about 16, I killed a lot of people for the cartel, for money." And the tone that he said it in, it was as if he just said that he used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought that I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact, because I knew we would freak each other out. He confirmed that I had indeed understood correctly. We discuss what we should do and agree that there's no immediate threat, that we should just stay. Besides, we don't have anywhere else to go anyway, and it's already late. But from here, things got even crazier. We try to keep our composure and not completely freak out while still making conversation with our hosts. A few minutes later, though, the husband got up and went inside to grab something. He came back with a literal kilo of weed. It was pressed into a brick, and he proceeded to break bits off the brick and roll them into a joint that was about the size of my thumb. And if I had to guess, I would say that there was about 2 grams in there. Of course, he offered the joint to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little bit offended, but fortunately for us, he bought our excuse. But wait, because it gets worse than that. A few minutes later, we heard a couple of loud bangs. The wife became a bit uneasy before asking her husband, "What was that?" To which he answered calmly, 9mm, which basically confirmed my suspicion that that sound had indeed been shots. I would say it was around 7, maybe 8 shots, fired pretty quickly after each other. The wife got nervous and asked if we should maybe go inside. And what do you think they're shooting at? In the air? Cows? At people? But the husband just shrugged it off, and we stayed outside. When again, a few minutes later, there were more shots, this time much closer in proximity. That's when the wife got even more upset and asked again, "Do you think we should go inside? What do you think they're shooting at?" I think I will never forget when he answered in the calmest way imaginable, "No, everything's okay. I haven't heard any screams yet." I don't know why, but the way he just calmly said that freaked me out even more than I already was. And even just thinking back on it makes my heart beat uncontrollably. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. When we finally could talk in private, we basically both lost it on each other and became absorbed by our panic. What the fuck were we supposed to do? We're locked in a house with a contract killer in the middle of absolutely fucking nowhere, and people are shooting outside. We decided that it was probably our best bet to stay, because we thought, well, we're his guests. He's not going to harm us, right? And plus, it's better to have walls and dogs, maybe even a serial killer, in between us and people shooting around. So we barricaded ourselves in the room and didn't sleep 1 second of that night before we noped the fuck out of there and went to the airport in the morning. I can tell you, I've never been so happy to be patted down at security in my entire life. I wanted to share this story as a warning to people. It's not necessarily as creepy as they come, but it's a story that is weird and freaks me out to this day. So, I'm traveling around the country in my car. I've been driving for over a week from the city I lived in, and have so far slept in my car every night as a means to save money. It wasn't until I got to a big enough city that I decided to treat myself to an actual bed, one that would be more comfortable than my back seat. I opted to find something on Airbnb because it's often cheaper than hotels. I booked this particular stay the day before I arrived at the city, so there weren't many options left. I'd found this apartment, and it looked new, modern, and it was in a great location. The price was decent for its spot, and it almost seemed too too good to be true. The only downfall was that it was listed as a new listing, so it had 0 reviews. I figured the price was so low because it was new, and decided that it would be worth giving it a shot. It must be legit because it's Airbnb, right? When I got to the apartment building, it was much older looking than I had expected. I later found out that my Airbnb was the only renovated apartment in the building, and the building itself seemed to be in poor condition. It looked more like a dorm hall rather than a typical apartment building. Anyway, I let it all slide because I wasn't paying too much, so what could I really expect? The apartment itself looked like the pics in the posting, so that was good enough for me. Everything went well for the first 2 days. As a female traveling alone, I always do my best to make sure I'm safe. I don't go out when it's dark, and I always lock the door behind me. Every single lock, including the chain thing. But on the 3rd day, I was out all morning and came back to the apartment to change before heading to the beach. I had again locked the door, including the chain. I was in front of the door watching TV while changing, when the door suddenly unlocks and someone begins to open it. Now, at this point, I realized that I'm beyond lucky to have put the lock chain on the door, or else it would have swung all the way open. I was standing there naked, and no one else was supposed to have the keys. My initial immediate reaction was to say, "Excuse me," before pushing the door shut and locking it once again. It took me a second to wrap my head around it, but I then tried to look out the peephole, although I don't see anybody outside of the door. I plant myself and sit in front of the door, both scared and shocked, realizing that whoever this person was could technically still get in here, since they obviously had the keys to the apartment. At first I thought maybe it was the owner coming back after I checked out, but I wasn't supposed to check out until the following day, so it wasn't likely that that was the case. After catching my bearings for a few moments, I called the owner and told her what had happened. She told me that no one else should have a set of keys other than her and I, and that she's at work, and it definitely wasn't her. At this point, I was scared to be in the apartment because someone could come in. I didn't want to leave because I had all my valuables here, and it seemed like a lose-lose situation. I then phoned my father, who told me that it was not okay that someone else had the keys, and that the host needs to take care of this ASAP. So that's when he called her, and she told him that she would be at the apartment shortly with a locksmith to change the locks and give me a new set of keys. Once there, the host proceeds to tell me that she's only had the apartment for 6 months, and that before I stayed there was only one other Airbnb booking. She also mentioned to me that other than these 2 bookings, the apartment had been sitting empty because she'd been attempting to renovate it, which now makes sense as to why the building looked like absolute shit and didn't match the apartment. She told me that the only possibility for who that was is that it could have been the previous owners or someone related to them. That theory really messed with me. How is it possible that I was gone all day, every day, and then the 10 minutes that I was home, someone tried to come in? Did they know I was there? What were they coming in for? If this apartment has been sitting empty for half a year, maybe that's something they did frequently. Or maybe they just saw me come in and tried to do something to me? These questions are constantly flowing in my mind. I just know that I'm lucky that I put the chain on the door. Or else, well, I don't even want to know what else could have happened. Beyond this stay, I won't be staying in an Airbnb that has no reviews or seems too good to be true, because if it fits that bill, it's likely too good to be true. Back in 2019, I, an 18-year-old female student, decided to download Tinder a few months after a rough breakup. I was pretty inexperienced with dating and painfully shy, so it seemed unlikely that I would meet a potential partner in person. Anyway, after a few matches that led to nothing, I came across the profile of a 20-year-old guy that I found very attractive. We matched, exchanged Snapchats, and ultimately set up a date. Our first date was relatively normal and even enjoyable. We saw a movie, and by the end of it, I felt like we had hit it off. However, our relationship itself was extremely short-lived. Not long after I had agreed to be his girlfriend, which was no more than a month after going out our first time, he began to behave very erratically. He'd sometimes fall completely silent in the middle of conversations, ignoring me when I'd try to ask him what was wrong. He became hot-tempered, slamming doors and speeding on the roadway as if he was mad. I started to feel really uncomfortable about our relationship. This went on for a few weeks until one night when we were on our way to have dinner downtown. He fell silent mid-conversation as he was known to do. I became extremely anxious as he pulled into a nearby parking garage, wondering what I had done to upset him. As we parked, I decided to ask him what was wrong. He didn't answer, so when I asked him again, he glared at me and shouted to shut the fuck up. I was completely frozen for a moment, but after I snapped back to it, I got the courage to tell him that we were done. I quickly gathered all my belongings from the car and walked over to the nearest coffee shop to call an Uber. It was fairly late that evening, so I walked as fast as I could, hoping that he just wouldn't follow me. Once I made it to the shop, I noticed that I had several missed calls from him. And when I made it home that night, I blocked him on all social media and decided that I would never contact him again. I'm fairly familiar with the dynamic of toxic relationships, and I knew that if he could talk to me that way, completely unprompted, it was likely that he was capable of much, much more. About a week goes by as I start to settle my emotions a bit. I decide to confide in a friend, one who had never met this guy, about what had happened, feeling completely embarrassed about the whole situation. Well, a few nights later, I received a text from the same friend. It was a screenshot of an Instagram DM from someone that she didn't follow. My now ex. The message said something to the effect of, "Hey, I'm sorry we're having to meet like this, but OP is ignoring me, and I just need to talk to her." My heart jumped into my throat. I decided to message all of my friends separately, let them know what had happened, just in case he was out to DM all of them. Later that week, I began receiving several DMs from various accounts, all without profile pictures or any posts. Eventually, I gave in and responded to a single one, asserting that the relationship was now over and that I didn't want to hear from him again. I blocked all the accounts immediately afterwards, and as time went on without hearing a word for weeks, I figured I had reached the end of the situation. That was until one morning, leaving my house for work, I walked out to my car and noticed something dangling around the handle of my car door. It was a necklace that I had gifted him. Now, he had only picked me up once from my house before, and the thought of him driving to my home, which was about an hour away from his place, solely with the intent of suspending this gift from my door handle, absolutely freaked me out. I was shaken up for a minute. It was by no means an expensive necklace, and I myself had the exact same one. But I kept it pushing. I thought maybe it was his way of acknowledging that we were done and complete. 2 months later, I was working my job at a small boutique near my house. I was used to answering the phone several times a day, so when the phone rang, I thought nothing of it. But when I picked it up, I immediately recognized his voice on the other end. He launched into a tirade, rambling about how he wanted a specific sweatshirt back, but I hung up before he could finish. That was the last time that I would ever mention to someone I was casually dating just where I worked. I was completely losing it at this point, especially considering that he had never called me at work while we were together. I had no idea how he even knew that I was working on that day or at that time. I told my older sister about the situation, and she, being very protective, decided that she would take it upon herself to message him. She told him unequivocally to leave me alone, and if he really wanted it, she offered to give him back the sweatshirt on my behalf. But he refused, simply insisting on meeting with me and only me to get the sweatshirt back. When it became abundantly clear that he didn't actually want the sweatshirt back, she made it clear right back that I wouldn't hesitate to go get a protection order. To this, he never responded. While I've yet to hear anything more from this guy up to this point, there are times where I still feel uneasy. You know that feeling you get when someone outside your view is staring at you? That's the sensation. It'll happen as I'm walking in my front door, ordering coffee, even hanging out with friends in public. I'd be willing to admit that I may just be paranoid at this particular time. But part of me wonders if there's more to just these feelings than what I'm prepared to admit. This happened in November 2016 in Glasgow, Scotland. I was desperate, I gotta admit. I'd been single and alone for some time, and this fact was driving me crazy. That's when I swiped right on Laura. She came across as a very sweet girl and all, but she was in quite a hurry to meet me. Something that now I see as a red flag. But back then, I just went with it. She insisted that we go to the pub. No fancy dates were necessary, and this was something that I didn't mind. Well, at first glance, I knew that I'd been swindled. She looked majorly different from what I'd seen before, but I didn't mind. I was just happy to have a date, and I'm not exactly so good looking myself, so I gave her a chance to redeem herself. We got to talking, and after a few beers, things began to get a bit more intimate. Now, before I go any further, I have to explain. She was a rather hefty young woman with long dark hair, and she had eyeshadow similar to Amy Winehouse, which makes sense because she said she was a huge fan. I'd asked about her hobbies and interests, but she asked me to talk more about myself. I told her about my job. She yawned sarcastically. "Let's talk about your sex life," she said. She had slipped her foot out of her shoe and started rubbing around my groin with her bare foot. Needless to say, this got me going. So yeah, I don't have much to say in that department, as it had been a while since I had last had sex, and I was very honest with her. I asked about hers, and she says she has her kinks, and that she's, quote, done things that I could never imagine. Want to see what I can do? If we go to my place, you can see what I can do. She then said that if we headed to her place, she'd be glad to show me what she could do. So at this point, I'm beginning to feel a bit drunk, which I was amazed at, as I was only on my 4th pint. I did have a couple of shots intermingled in there, so I put it down to this. We'd waited outside the pub for a taxi, and she was holding my hand, excitedly whispering into my ear all the things that she was going to do to me, all the things that I'd never experienced before. In a way, I actually just couldn't wait to get to sleep. My head felt heavier than the rest of my body. It was almost as if the ground was moving beneath me. The rest was a blur. I can't remember getting into the taxi, but I do remember falling down the stairs as she was laughing above me. "Come on," she said. "Get your sexy ass up here." I struggled my way up the stairs, and before I knew it, from what I could remember, I was in her bedroom, naked. It was as if I'd blacked out between the staircase and her bed sheets. I tried to sit up, only to find myself tied to the bed by my arms and legs. She entered the room dressed in bondage gear. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I was deeply aroused by this, but I was confused at the same time. She performed all sorts of different acts on me before moving on to full intercourse. I lay there delighted, don't get me wrong, but something felt incredibly off about it all. I had dozed off for a bit, before being woken up by a weird screeching sound. "What are you doing?" I mumbled, as I looked down to see this woman wrapping my legs with cling film. "Hush now," she said. "This is the best bit." I was no longer tied to the bed, but I felt numb, and I couldn't move my arms and legs. She proceeded to wrap me up from my legs upwards. The whole time I was screaming at her to stop, before she placed some cling film in my mouth to help shut me up. I was struggling to breathe at this point, and had done my best to dislodge the ball of film from my mouth. Eventually, I was wrapped entirely from head to toe, and I could barely see outside of the wrap. She told me that this was my punishment for being so terrible in bed, and that she has many other victims just like me, all wrapped up and waiting to die. When she left the room, I gave out some muffled screams before I slowly felt myself fading away. I woke up what was now the next day and able to breathe. This time, there were people looking at me concerned. They'd removed most of the cling film and had given me space to catch my breath. I wasn't fully aware of this until they told me, and it turned out that I wasn't actually in Laura's flat, but an old-fashioned hotel. The police were then all over me, asking me questions about what had happened. I attempted to show them Laura's Tinder profile, but it didn't exist any longer. It seems that right after leaving me in wraps, Laura had deleted her page. I'm grateful to my rescuers, but forever traumatized by this incident, and I end up with panic attacks when I see people that even remotely resemble her. It took me a few years to finally trust people enough to go back on dates, but I'm still on the road to recovery mentally. I'm just glad that I'm still alive, although more often than not, I find myself wondering if she's still out there, and if there are others like me, ones that may not have made it. I feel compelled to share my story because I still find it so unbelievably surreal. I'm not sure if this is the right sub to be posting this, but hopefully it applies. In the fall of 2020, I started using dating apps because I really wanted to branch out and meet some new guys. I had just moved back home after I graduated college in May, which was still some of the pretty earliest stages of COVID, so I was lonely. After matching with a few guys on Tinder, I found them nice, but the conversations kind of died off after a while. I didn't really form a real connection with anyone on there. Now, one of the guys I matched with asked me for my Snapchat, which I gave to him so we could talk on there, and we also followed each other on Instagram. That kind of stuff seems harmless to me, and I really didn't think much of it. Our conversations didn't last long either, and we ultimately stopped talking after just a few days. I found the guy just a little strange, so much so that I was actually turned off by it. Fast forward a couple months, and I get a message from him randomly on Instagram. He told me that he had unfollowed me due to my support for a specific presidential candidate. He then proceeded to spam me with probably over 40 messages, trying to convince me to change my views and to vote red. I'm a very liberal person, and if I would have known he was like this at all, I would have never spoken to him. Mixed in with his rapid-fire messages, he told me that people have blocked him for doing this before, and to please just understand where he's coming from. His last few messages were memes, I'm sure sent to try and ease the tension of the one-sided conversation. Even when we were chatting, we didn't speak about anything like this, so for him to feel so comfortable messaging me like this only raised more flags in my mind. I didn't respond. I didn't even block him. I just opened the messages so he could see that I saw them before I unfollowed him. Well, the next morning, I got several notifications telling me this message has been unsent by the sender for every single one of his rambling messages. So of course, I screen recorded it and sent it off to my best friend, telling her what had happened because I found it creepy and a bit bizarre. But it was over after that though, and the topic of this guy didn't come up again, so I was completely content to move on. This next part had to have happened a few weeks after the deluge of DMs. I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw a post from a local news station that was shared from the town that this guy was from in my state, a town that's about an hour away from me. The post was a news article about a man who had shot and killed an 87-year-old woman who lived in his apartment complex with a semi-automatic rifle. After executing this poor woman, he was trying to goad other residents out of their apartments before he himself was fired upon and killed by another resident in order to protect the others who lived there. As I was reading this article, the guy's name and face seemed so familiar. When it finally clicked, it was the same guy who I had matched with and had been sending me messages on Instagram. I went back to the screen recording of the messages that I had taken a month ago, and it confirmed that it was him. Even now, I'm not sure how to describe what my response was, but I remember my heart racing, my palms sweating, and overall feeling like the world was moving beneath me. It's extremely disturbing to know that I spoke to this man and even had my own weird experience with him. Even though it's been a few years and this man doesn't occupy this realm anymore, I still feel odd about it. I was reading about this story again recently, since more details have been reported since the initial shooting. Sometimes I find myself thinking about the what ifs. Like, what if I had responded to his messages the way that I truly wanted to? Called him a creep, a weirdo, and pissed him off to the point of violence. Would he have tried to harm me? The police have long since closed their investigation. They claim that the guy was mentally ill, and that in a psychosis brought on by his condition, it caused him to lash out unprovoked and cause the damage that he did. I don't know if any of that is true, or is simply convenient when trying to label a case as closed. It's just wild to consider that any of us can unknowingly be communicating with potential murderers, psychopaths, and generally unwell individuals, all through these small electronic boxes in our pockets that link the entire world. In addition, be wary of just who you swipe on. I went to college in a historic, mid-sized city in Florida, and at the time, I lived in a duplex, maybe 3 blocks from campus. The city itself is known to be pretty safe, and I also lived in a pretty decent area, with large, history-bearing homes near me. This all happened about 5 years ago. A little backstory that will become relevant. The duplex I lived in had a front door that locked, and then both the upstairs and downstairs unit had their own locking doors as well. I lived downstairs and had 2 roommates, but this specific night, only one of my roommates was home. We knew the girls that lived upstairs, but only really spoke to them in passing. When they moved in, we emphasized just how important it was for them to keep the main front door locked, and they did a good job of doing so. So me and my roommate were in for the night. Knowing the front door is locked, we sparked up a few joints. At some point, we hear a knock at the front door and quickly realize that the girls upstairs had ordered a pizza. Later on, it becomes evident that they never locked the front door after receiving their pizza. So as the night begins to wear on, my roommate and I decide to call it a night. We head to our rooms, and since I had a queen bed, I would often sleep with my phone and laptop next to me. Well, a couple hours after I fall asleep, I wake up to a strange man standing over my bed. As soon as I realize that I'm not dreaming, I notice that he's quickly moving my phone and computer off of my mattress and attempting to move my comforter. It appears as if he's trying to get into my bed. I start to ask him who he is, what's he doing here, and just generally confused, as I was still slightly high from before I went to sleep. The only thing that he said to me, and he said it multiple times, was that he was just trying to get in bed. At this point, I start to panic. My mind obviously goes to the worst. I was hoping that maybe my roommate had invited some random Tinder guy over, and that he had gone to the wrong room. But the more I questioned him, all he had to say was, "I'm just trying to get in bed." I owned pepper spray and a stun gun, but of course, I had left them on a shelf that the guy was standing in front of, so there was no way I'd be able to grab them without at least escalating the situation. Realizing that I needed to do something quickly, I blurted, "There are 5 people who live in this house, and if you don't get the fuck out now, I'll scream, and they'll all be in here within seconds." Now, luckily, that's all that it took to scare him off. I don't know if he had brought something with him or if he stole something from me, but I saw him grab something in the dark before running out of my room. As soon as he left, I popped up, shut the door, and locked it. I also tried to find my phone, but to no avail. I quickly realized that between my room and the front door is the bedroom of my roommate that was home. As scared as I was terrified that the guy had maybe gone into her room. So I grabbed my stun gun and my pocket knife, counted to 3, and ripped open my door. I ran straight to my roommate's room, only to find her still fast asleep, and there was no evidence of the guy in her room. I woke her up and told her what happened. She asked me if I was sure that I wasn't dreaming, which then got me to question myself. That is, until I walked out of her room and saw that her front door was wide open. I went back to my room to search for my phone, and I finally found it, hidden under a pile of clothes across my room from where I had left it. That sent a chill up my spine, as I immediately knew for a fact that someone had been in the house and in my room while I was sleeping. They had been there long enough to hide my phone, which only worsened my suspicions of their intentions. I ran back to my roommate's room, who at that point believed me. We shut our door and barricaded ourselves in there before calling 911. Within minutes, there were police cars swarming our street, and they yelled for us to exit the residence and head towards them. At least a dozen police officers came running in and searched every inch of our apartment. They also woke the upstairs girls up and searched their apartment as well, just to ensure that the man had left. The officers then had me write a statement, and I gave them a description of the man, although to this day, I've never heard a single thing about this case. I feel incredibly lucky with the outcome of the situation, but the thought of his intentions still terrifies me, and additionally the fact that he was never caught scares me just as well, as I would hate for anyone to have to go through the pure fear that I did. I'll also add, there's a chance that this man was on drugs, or perhaps mentally ill, and held no bad intentions whatsoever. But because he was never caught, I'll never know. And my mind? Well, that's always going to assume the worst. I'm typing this from the living room of a friend's house. What I'm wanting to share happened no more than an hour or so ago, and I'm still trying to process what I just encountered. Me and my buddies, Max and Brock, names changed for anonymity's sake, we're a group of 22-year-old guys. Max and Brock live together in the house that I'm at, whereas I live across town by myself. We went out last night for a little fun. The kind of fun that involved a bit of a bar crawl, late night tacos, and an Uber ride back to their house. Needless to say, by the time we landed, I wasn't really in the kind of shape to drive myself all the way back home. So after making sure it was cool with the homies, I grabbed a sheet and a pillow from their downstairs closet, something that I've done maybe a dozen times before, and made myself a cozy spot on their couch. Everyone said their goodnights at around 2:30 a.m., and presumably we all knocked out. I know I did at least. Well, fast forward a few hours. I'm in a dead sleep, the kind that's been assisted by a copious amount of alcohol, when I hear the front door click open and shut. From where my head is, the door is no more than 10 feet away, so hearing it make noise in the middle of the night doesn't surprise me. With my eyes still closed, I'm thinking that Brock or Max was taking a step out to smoke or something. But as I crack my eyes ever so slightly, I'm surprised when I don't see either one of my friends. Rather, a tall, super slender woman in the entryway of the home. I've never seen this lady before. She's wearing a long red or salmon-colored dress, and maybe some kind of scarf wrapped around her head. Forgive me, I'm not very good with women's accessories. I'm not sure why, but my default was to pretend that I was still asleep. Although as she got within a foot or two of the couch and knelt down right at face level, I knew that the jig was up. I fully opened my eyes and trained them in on this woman, doing my best to make out her face in the ultra-dim light. That's when she put a hand on my shoulder, almost as if to settle me, and she began asking me questions that I didn't understand. The sentences themselves were in English, but they seemed jumbled and incoherent. She held a set of papers in her hands and kept glancing at them as if she were reading her Yoda-styled questions off of them. I sat up and asked who she was and why she walked in here uninvited. Her reply was that she was from some research department or something, before she asked me for my name. I didn't respond, just kind of looked around searching for any inkling that this wasn't happening. I thought about calling out for my friends, or even just making a dash for one of their rooms. But at this moment, I was a bit frozen, not sure if I should be fearing for my safety or not. I reached for my phone to call Max, and after the most awkward 10 to 15 seconds of stone-cold silence, this woman simply nodded in my direction and said, "I can see that you're not ready. That's okay," before calmly walking out the door again. From where I was still frozen on the couch, I could see her make her way towards the street before turning right and walking out of view. Once she was out of sight, that snapped me back. I rushed to the door to make sure that it was locked tight before finding a seat on the stairs leading to Max and Brock's rooms. I guess the commotion of me plopping on the stairs was enough to wake them up, because as they stumble to their doorways, they see me and ask if I'm all right. Still fighting the shock, I just sit there, trying to get my racing heart to calm down. As I explained what had just happened, Max offered that he thought that it was weird, but surprisingly seemed unconcerned, and bounced back into his room after only a few moments. Brock was a bit more empathetic as he sat with me on the steps. He shared in my shock, and he even acknowledged the fact that sometimes Max can be a bit too nonchalant when it comes to locking doors when he's faded. Brock eventually took himself back into his room after patting me on the back and telling me to get some rest. But after this happened, how the fuck am I supposed to go back to sleep? I'm not drunk anymore, and I'm ready to just go home. But I'm also still shaking, so I don't want to be behind the wheel. I'm back on the couch, but no way am I going to be calm enough to doze off. I find myself here sharing this story with internet strangers because I still don't know what just happened. It was as strange as any dream I can remember having, and yet I'm 100% sure that I wasn't asleep. I don't think that I've ever been this unnerved in my life. And I just want to tell you all, thank you for listening. In the year 2006, I was a college student at Arizona State University. I lived in an off-campus apartment on a ground floor, and it was a block off from a major street here in Phoenix called Baseline. That detail might be important for later. In the summer of 2006, Phoenix was plagued by two serial killers. One was the Phoenix shooter, who ended up being a team of two guys randomly shooting people. And the other was the Baseline killer, a serial rapist and murderer. Having two killers on the loose put the entire city on edge, and everyone that I knew was talking about it. There were even articles in Time and Newsweek about the situation. So the fall semester had just started. Now, you may have heard this, but Phoenix is hot in August. It would get so stuffy in my apartment, so I'd pretty much be forced to leave the window cracked a little bit because the morning air is nice. My blinds provided a little visual cover. Anyway, one morning, a strange sound woke me up from my sleep. It was before the crack of dawn, 4:45 a.m., and the sun was just barely beginning to peek up over the horizon. The sound that I heard was of someone lightly tapping on my window, and it seemed intentional. In my tired state, I figured maybe it could be a bird, or some branches, or something trivial like that. Tap, tap, tap. Silence. After about 90 seconds of nothing, the tapping returned, and it was absolutely purposeful. I was positive at this point that it was a human producing this noise. In my half-awake state, I thought that it could have been my boyfriend, who always thought that it was cute to try and scare me. I decided I'd be a bit of a brat and make him wait, but I was also getting really angry at the tapping. How dare he try to pull a prank on me while I sleep? This is just like him. I'm gonna give him a piece of my mind about disturbing my sleep like this. Tap, tap, tap. At a certain point through all of this, I got up to get a glass of water, still being in the mindset of wanting to annoy my stupid boyfriend who thought that this would be funny. But that's when I saw some movement through the slit of my blinds. That's when I marched over and yanked the blinds so that I could see. Definitely not my boyfriend out there. I said loudly and emphatically, "What the f***?" That's when the man that was out there seemed taken aback by my anger, albeit only slightly. The man that I saw crouched outside of my window will forever be with me, or more specifically, his eyes and the feeling they gave me were insanely creepy. Honestly, words just can't do justice to how terrifying those eyes were. They looked like black orbs with no white around them. Absolutely predatory. When I see pictures of Ted Bundy or Charles Manson, that's exactly what he looked like. Even if you saw a picture of how they looked, it's different when you experience them in person. It totally floored me. Something about this man, even beyond tapping at my window, was profoundly wrong. He was crouched down almost like a baseball umpire. He had on dark pants, a purple or black shirt, and a dark Nike hat. He was dark complected, maybe just about entering middle age. But that's just about all I got, given that it was still so dark. After I yelled, "What the f*** at him?" he whispers to me, "Can I talk to you?" And if you want to know how insanely creepy that is to hear, just whisper that sentence out loud to yourself right now. It still sends chills down my spine when I think of how it hit my ear. As my brain is making sense of what I just heard, I notice his hand subtly move towards his waist. Now, this is about a 3-second interaction at this point, and for some reason, I thought of Ted Bundy and how he'd pretend to be crippled to target his victims. I thought back to my mom telling me to not be so nice to strangers and to not be afraid to be a bitch. My thinking wasn't as calculated as all that, but it was more the nano-processing of how to deal with this particular situation. So when he whispered what he did, I began yelling at him. "Hell no. Get the fuck out of here, asshole." I shut the window angrily and locked it. I can't overemphasize how incredibly irritated I was that this person had the audacity to disturb my precious sleep. I laid back down and wondered if I'd perhaps been too mean. What if that guy needed help? But that didn't really make sense. Why would he be like tapping and whispering if he was truly in trouble? I decided then that he was a creep after all, and I was too annoyed to go back to sleep. But I did my best to lay there and calm myself down. I told my roommate about this a little later in the morning, and she sort of jokingly asked if it could have been the baseline killer. When she said that, my heart absolutely sank. This man's face looked exactly like it did in those police sketches that were on billboards. The only problem is that those billboards showed that man with dreadlocks, and the man that was at my window had no dreads. Nevertheless, I called the Phoenix Police Department, and the detective that I spoke to agreed that it did sound like the baseline killer's MO. The suspect would often say something to throw his targets off. Then he'd blitz attack them. The detective said that my angry response probably made me seem too much of a hassle, and then he moved on. The only problem was that I thought that this man looked Hispanic, and the detective said that many witnesses described the killer as being black. I thought that the cops might want to come out and try for samples or surveillance video or something, but I didn't hear back from the detective. Once my parents learned of this, they properly freaked out. For the household, they got us knives, pepper spray, and put up signs saying that the property was defended by Smith & Wesson. We learned later on that another tenant in the complex had complained the same morning. I never learned all the details, but this idiot was apparently going around the damn apartments trying his best to find a target. After this all occurred, the property management company wouldn't let us out of our lease, although they did allow for us to move to the second floor apartment right above our old unit. So while we may not have been able to move away, at least we weren't on the ground anymore. Fast forward to September 4th, 2006. The Phoenix Police Department arrests a man named Mark Godot. He's arrested on suspicion of being the baseline killer. When I saw his mugshot, I was sick to my stomach, but also relieved, because this was absolutely the man that stood outside my window all those mornings ago. The details that we would learn about his attacks would shake me even further to my core. The fact that he would use disarming questions to get his targets off kilter before blitzing them, subduing them, and ultimately doing what he pleased to them. He also never had dreadlocks, but he did make it a habit of utilizing wigs when he was out on the hunt. After being tried and found guilty for multiple heinous attacks, Mr. Godot now resides on death row in Arizona. In the years after his conviction, his wife tried to mount some campaign to show that the police were framing him, or something to that effect. On a personal level, it would certainly make for an interesting coincidence if this poor, innocent man who they framed was also out there whispering like a creep and tapping on my window. Now, think as I might, I can't think of anything more scary than a serial killer tapping on your window before daybreak. That's something that actually happened to me. And if it happens to you, the only thing that I can say is do your best to scare them back. Don't be afraid to be downright rude to someone who's injecting themselves into your space. It could save your life if you're not afraid to throw your weight around and tell someone off. Trust yourself. you can still be the most kind and generous person in the world, while still telling someone to fuck off.